Ron W. Henley. And today we're going to take a look at a series of DVDs on one of my favorite openings from even my childhood, the 2 C3 Sicilian. And why is this important? Well, to start with, quite a few players, including Gary Kasparov and Bobby Fischer, consider 1 E4 to be absolutely White's best move. And it's also pretty universally accepted that against E4, Black's most fighting response is C5, the Sicilian defense. And frankly, who has time to learn every single specialized variation of the Sicilian defense? So, what you need is you need an opening like I had with the C3 Sicilian that you can basically play 2 C3 and Black is playing on your home turf. So in this first series of DVDs, we will look at playing 2 C3 and then we will look at primarily 2 D5, which is Black's most popular response. We will also look at all of the, quote, weaker second move alternatives, G6, 2 D6, 2 B6, even 2 Queen A5 was first played by Sigbert Tarrasch. We'll take a look at that, even 2 E5. We'll look at all the minor alternatives that Black has, and we'll show you how to play against them. The other things we will do is, rather than just show you specific variations, we'll start with a historical overview. In the historical overview, we will see fantastic strategists such as Aaron Nimzovich. We will see the 3rd and 4th world champions, Jose Rayo, Capablanca, and Alexander Aliekin, also play the C3 Sicilian. But in more modern times, the real champion of the opening certainly has to be Grandmaster Evgeny Sveshnikov. Sveshnikov, over the course of a 40-year career, played over 600 games against top-notch international competition and had a score of at least 70%. This is absolutely a fantastic result against Black's most popular opening. Then we will follow with a very important section on winning with the queenside majority. This is an extremely useful and important strategic concept that will allow you to not only increase your chess understanding, but to win many, many games where your opponent doesn't even realize what is happening to him. It's so gradual, it's so insidious. Now the C3 Sicilian, for myself, like I said, I first played it in my youth, brought me a decisive victory in the last round of the Association of College Unions International Championship. I also remember as a young master playing in the World Open, I was able to make a draw with the legendary Grandmaster Pal Benko. And I must say, I can hardly recall ever even losing a game with the C3 Sicilian. It's very fundamentally sound positionally, and in many variations you have your queenside majority built in, which gives you that extra edge. In the Sicilian defense after E4, C5, the move 2 C3 is relatively a newcomer compared to moves like 2 F4 or 2 B4, the wing gambit, which were analyzed by Greco as early as 1620. The move 2 C3 first appeared in tournaments in London 1841, and we'll look at that game. A master, H.W. Popper, is playing White against the famous Howard Staunton. After 2 C3, Staunton, playing Black, played E6. White now played Knight F3, and after D5, E5. We get close to a version of the advanced French. Now today's master, of course, knows that D4 is probably the best way for Black to obtain equality. However, in that day, after E5, Knight to C6, D4, we did in fact arrive at a position from the advanced French. Staunton correctly attacks the base of the white pawn chain on D4 with his queen, and White plays the gambit variation with bishop to D3. Black plays bishop to D7. And again, with the benefit of hindsight, thanks to the work of Aaron Nimzovich in the 1920s, we know that the proper way is to play C takes D4, C takes D4, and bishop D7, which is more precise. Note here, of course, that knight takes D4, knight takes D4, queen D4, bishop B5 check, is a discovered attack on the black queen. Now going back to bishop D7, White now sees that his pawn on D4 is attacked multiple times. The correct course, of course, would be D takes C5, bishop C5, and castles with the plan of advancing with B4. This was demonstrated quite nicely in my system by Aaron Nimzovich, the classic game being Nimzovich, White, against George Sawi. Back to our game at hand in 1841, after bishop d7, white played bishop to c2. Black now played rook c8. And again, today's masters in this type of position know that you should play cd4, cd4, and knight b4, chase after this very powerful, dangerous white bishop. And if white tries to save the bishop with bishop to b3, then of course bishop to b5, working on the d3 square, is very strong. But again, keep in mind, this was London, 1841, quite a long time ago. A lot of this theory had not been developed. So after rook c8, as played in the game, white now castled, and black played a5. White played a4, securing the b5 square, and black now played a positional weakness, g6. Today, of course, we know we do not want to be weakening the dark squares around our king side. White now got the correct idea with d takes c5, and after bishop takes c5, knight a3, routing the knight to the b5 square. Black, for his part, undermined the white center with f6, and after ef6, knight f6, knight to b5. Castles, we had a fairly normal looking position. White now inserted his bishop on h6, and black, according to Staunton himself, played a very premature counterattack with knight g4. This does attack the bishop, and attacks twice, and attacks 3 times on the f2 pawn. Note, instead of knight g4, had black continued with rook f7, knight g5 is a little better for white, or the attack bishop takes f2 check, rook takes f2, knight g4, looks very strong. It attacks the bishop, attacks the rook twice, but after queen d2, white simply connects everything and emerges with extra material. So going back to the game, after bishop h6, knight g4, white now accepted the exchange on f8, and after bishop f2 check, ducked his king in the corner, and on rook takes f8, played the very strong queen e2. This has a simple threat of h3, kicking the knight, followed by capturing on f2. After bishop c5, white followed with the powerful stroke, knight to d4. This attacks the knight on g4, the weak pawn on e6, and, probably most importantly, opens up the f-file. After rook f1, black still has problems to face. After e5, it appeared that he seemed to be doing okay. His knight is protected, his center pawns now seem mobile. However, queen to f3 reminded black how important the open f-file is, and the weakness on d5 and f7 is felt very rapidly. After knight d8, covering f7, queen takes d5 check, bishop e6, knight takes e6, knight takes e6, and the winning pin with bishop to b3. Staunton, in fact, at this point resigned. After knight f2 check, you simply chop it off, rook takes, bishop takes, and even stronger than capturing on e6 is the powerful knight to d6, cutting off the black queen's communication, leaving the knight pinned, leaving the black king very exposed. So all in all, a fantastic success for the first time out with the 2 c3 Sicilian. The next example we see of the 2 c3 Sicilian actually, surprisingly enough, occurred 1 year later in Paris, 1842. John William Schulten, a master, is playing white against the very famous Pierre Charles Saint-Amant. Saint-Amant, of course, was one of the strongest players of the time, and after c3, he now played e5. This, in my view, is a slightly dubious, from a positional point of view, continuation. However, it was quite popular for a while, and touted by the Russian trainer Filippenko much later in the next century. Now with Saint-Amant, of course, he sees white wants to play d4, and he puts a second pawn to pressure the d4 and f4 squares. White, in keeping with the spirit of the time, played f4. Of course, today's modern master would follow Sveshnikov's recommendation of knight f3, simply attacking the pawn on e5, and when black does something about the pawn with knight c6, bishop to c4. This very solid positional continuation offers white very reasonable chances for an advantage. The bishop is beautifully posted on the c4 to f7 diagonal. We will see some examples of that later when we look at the theoretical games. Back to our game from Paris, 1842, white continued very much in the style of the day, a la King's Gambit, with f4. After d6, played knight f3, and after e takes f4, established his pawn duo in the center with d4. After knight f6, bishop d3, bishop e7, bishop to f4. At this point, we can clearly say the opening has been a success for white. He has the pawn duo and excellent development. But after castles, knight d2, knight c6, castles, bishop g4, faced with the slightest bit of pressure on his center, white now mishandles the position. He played e5. This is a terrible mistake and premature, and tactically flawed because the bishop on d3 is simply on pre. Today's modern master would play d5, gaining a serious space advantage, and after knight h5, for example, attacking the bishop on f4, simply retreat with bishop e3, and after knight e5, again another retreat with bishop d2 would leave white very well placed. The black pieces are going to have to do something to resolve the situation, and white's going to enjoy a space advantage. So again, after bishop to f4, we can say the opening was clearly a success for white, but coming back to this position after e5, d takes e5, d takes e5, a terrible mistake according to Saint-Amant, and we have to agree with him. He recommended bishop e5, but even then, after knight takes, pawn takes, queen takes, pawn takes, and bishop takes on f6, black simply has one extra pawn and beautiful pair of bishops. Again, winning by today's standards. But going back to the game, after d takes e5, d takes e5, black now played knight h5. White has both of his bishops under attack, and after bishop h7 check, king takes, knight to g5 check, black continued accepting everything white offered, with bishop takes, queen takes, and knight takes f4. Clearly black has a winning material advantage. After knight e4, knight back to e6, queen h5 check, king g1, and again, very much in the spirit of the day, white threw everything that he could at black, but after queen e7, rook d7, queen takes, knight check, pawn takes, rook takes, and bishop takes, white now realized he was completely out of material, 2 rooks and 2 knights behind, and appropriately enough tossed in the towel. So, not a great outing for our second historical c3 Sicilian, although this defeat cannot be blamed on the opening. Clearly, the opening position reached after 7 bishop to f4 is excellent for white. In our next historical example, occurred quite a number of years later in Berlin, 1864. Playing black was the famous Adolf Anderssen, and playing white was the master Berthold Schul. After e4, c5, we now see the first example of the 2 knight f3 move order. And after e6, white now played c3, preparing to play d4 and establish the duo pawn center. After knight c6, d4, white did in fact establish the pawn duo on e4 and d4, and after d5, black has sort of a French defense setup. Sveshnikov considers that e5, playing the white side of the advanced French, is probably the best way for white to play for theoretical advantage. Sveshnikov was tremendously successful from this type of position and showed many fine examples of how to handle white's prospects. Back in Berlin, 1864, though, white played e takes d5, and after e takes d5, played bishop to e2. Bishop to b5 was Karpov's choice against Polgar in Linares 1994, a game that we will look at. That game was played, of course, 230 years later than our present game. Also, instead of bishop to e2, bishop to e3 pressuring the c5 pawn and trying to encourage clarification of the center was a big favorite of Edward Rosenthalis, Soviet master who had a lot of success on the white side of the c3 Sicilian. I'm sure we will see many of his games much later. Back to Berlin 1864 after bishop e2, knight f6, castles, c takes d4. Now, again, today's modern master probably would take with the knight and try to play against the weak pawn or isolated pawn on d5, if you will. But after c takes d4, keeping this symmetrical pawn structure, bishop e7, knight c3, castles, bishop e3. White does have a slight lead in development, but it's pretty negligible in terms of creating an advantage. After bishop d6, queen d2, bishop e6, knight g5, bishop f5, and now white goes on a bit of a fishing expedition with f4. He voluntarily weakens his square on e4. After rook e8, h3, rook c8, knight back to f3, we can see clearly from a positional point of view after knight e4, bishop e4, black stands better. Has complete control of the e4 square. His rooks are placed on the open files. That notwithstanding, white managed to draw the game in 56 moves. A pretty unconvincing performance on the third game out for our c3 Sicilian, but historically significant because it did introduce the 2 knight f3 move order. To continue with our historical development of the c3 Sicilian after e4, c5, c3, we have to push the clock ahead 34 more years. The master Simon Alapin, and thus the c3 Sicilian became known in some circles as the Alapin Sicilian, played it in the tournament of Vienna 1898. First game we will look at is Simon Alapin as white against Emanuel Stepan Schiffers, a noted master of the period. Schiffers played e6, and after d4, d5, again we get the French defense type formation. After e takes d5, e takes d5, knight to f3, black played knight to f6. Probably not the most accurate. After bishop to b5 check, knight c6, castles, c takes d4, white tossed in rook e1 check. After bishop e7, knight takes d4, and we can see white has quite a bit more pressure than in the previous game we studied. After bishop d7, white now played queen e2, keeping pressure on the e-file on the bishop on e7. After knight takes d4, cd4, bishop b5 check, queen takes, queen d7, and knight c3. Note that if white tried to take advantage of the pin on the e-file, black could just cleverly castle, and queen takes e7 fails to rook at f to e8 due to the weakness of the white first rank. Going back to the game after queen d7, knight c3, queen takes b5, knight b5, king d7, and black has managed to equalize. The king in the center in the endgame with the queens off the board is actually an advantage. After a3, a6, knight back to c3, rook at a to c8, bishop g5. This creates the possibility of capturing on f6 and then capturing on d5. Rook c4, bishop takes f6, bishop f6, and knight d5. Rook takes d4, and now white settled for a very minuscule advantage with knight takes f6, g takes f6, and rook at a to d1. What's instructive about this game is that after rook d1, this is one of the first games where we see white play the c3 Sicilian and then nurture a very tiny advantage all the way into the endgame. Later, when we learn to play the c3 Sicilian, this is already a mistake by black. It turns out he needs to play his king to e6 so that he has the c-file available to offer counterplay for his own rook. After king c6, white now played rook to d3. The white rook is able to lift over to the king side and attack the black pawns. After rook e8 threatening mate on e1, simply king f1. rook e5, and now we see the superior mobility of the white rook. First attacks the f6 pawn, threatens it with check. After f5, then rook h3. Black now plays a5, looking to get his own queenside counterplay in gear with rook to b5, but white comes first with rook takes h7. After rook b5, rook takes f7, and rook b2, black's hoping to get his queenside pawn majority going. White plays a very nice in-between check here, and after king b5 is able to capture the pawn on b5 with check, and now has 3 connected passed pawns on the king side. After king a4, it clearly becomes a race. We've now reached the situation where time is the most critical element. After g4, rook c2, g5, we can see white is not only ahead in material, but well ahead in time. After b5, g6, rook c8, now the h-pawn kicks it into gear to join the g-pawn. After b4, ab, ab, and rook f7, white has a decisive advantage. After b3, rook check, king b4, rook b7 check, getting behind the passed pawn, king c3, g7, and on b2, h5, rook a8, h6, rook check, king g2, rook back, and h7. Black tried one last trick with rook a7, hoping maybe for rook takes b2 and rook takes g7 check, but of course white simply queened one pawn and black now resigned. In fact, after rook takes rook, pawn to the 8th, 2 queens, and we can see no problem for white. A very, very instructive example, and one of the first examples of white nursing an minuscule in-game advantage all the way in to winning the game. The second game from Vienna 1898, where Simon Alapin played the c3 Sicilian, was against the redoubtable German Dr. Siegbert Tarrasch. Now, an interesting point is that Alapin was not particularly a great theoretician or anything, but he played c3 just simply to avoid all the other variations of the Sicilian defense at that time. His best results were first and second in Chigorin and St. Petersburg. He did win match victories against von Bartheleben and against Levitsky, and drew a match with Karl Schlechter, and also finished 5th in Monte Carlo and first prize in Munich 1911. So Simon Alapin was a player of some note. However, his results with the c3 Sicilian were not absolutely overwhelming. For example, if we look at this game here with Tarrasch, we will see after queen a5, very interesting, bit unusual, and probably borderline dubious idea by black. Black realizes that white wants to play the d4 pawn duo, and thus he pins the c3 pawn. After knight f3, knight c6, white now played knight a3. Sveshnikov himself, many years later, would actually play a3, and after e6, played d4, and after knight takes d4, thanks to the pin on the c3 pawn, knight d4, cd4, important to toss in the move b4 and break the pin. After the queen backed up, c takes d4, white was able to establish the pawn duo. After knight f6, bishop d3, d5, e5, knight d7, white had a very, very good variation of the French defense, and after rook a2, Sveshnikov scored a nice victory. We will look at that complete game later in the theoretical game section. Back to our game from Vienna, 1898, after knight a3, the knight does threaten to bop over to c4 and attack the prematurely developed black queen. After e6, white played knight to c4 right away. This may not be the strongest continuation. Probably today, I would prefer a slower build-up with bishop e2, followed by castles, and simply d4. I've now established my pawn duo, and have to ask the black queen what she's doing out on a5. But after knight c4, queen c7, white now played d4, but after cd4, took with the knight. probably more thematic would be to take with the pawn on d4, and after d5, ed5, ed5, knight at c to e5, white does have a slight edge due to his beautiful outpost on e5. Back to our game at hand, after knight takes d4, Tarrasch now goes for kind of a Paulson Sicilian setup. Surprisingly modernistic style of playing he shows here. Again, keep in mind this is Vienna 1898. After bishop d3, he plays b5, attacking the knight, and after knight e3, knight f6, castles, bishop b7, knight f3, and bishop d6. And thanks to his bishops raking the white king side, black is already slightly better. Rook e1, knight to e5, exchanging off a queenside knight for a kingside knight. A very good idea, and increasing his control over the dark squares. After knight takes, bishop takes, we can already see the black bishops have really opened up nice diagonals against the white king. After knight f1, we have to say the opening has absolutely been a failure for white at this point. He has no active plan and a passive knight on the king side. Castles, queen e2, bishop to c6, bishop g5, rook at f to e8. White now played queen e3, and black proceeds a dark square campaign, offers to let white surrender the two bishops. After bishop h4, knight to h5. He now takes control of the f4 square. After bishop g3, sinks on into f4, and we can see black has played a beautiful plan of control on the dark squares. After bishop back to c2, he now anchors in with g5. White now cartwheels his knight back into the game with knight d2, and after queen d8, knight f3, f6, goes ahead and further secures the dark squares. After knight e5, fe5, white does, from an optical point of view, have the bishop pair. However, the knight on f4 certainly does more than hold its own against the white bishops. After f3, king h8, he now starts to build up on the king side. On queen c5, attacking the e5 pawn, black simply defends it. And on queen d6, not clear where that queen's going, rook g8, black begins to build for the king side pawn break. a4, white decides to open a file on the queen side, try to change a pair of rooks. But here, Tarrasch shows one of his very, very important principles. When you have a space advantage, you want to keep pieces on the board, or when you're trying to build for an attack. And therefore, he plays rook at a to f8. In my mind, this is an exclamation point move. This shows very clear thinking that he wants to attack on the king side, and therefore, when you're attacking, you want to have as many pieces as possible to outmaneuver the opponent. White plays bishop d3, trying to put pressure on the b5 pawn. Note that AB, c4, and after bc4, rook a5, trying to disrupt black's plan, might have been a better way to go. But even here, after rook to b8, black gets counterplay against the b2 pawn. After the less aggressive bishop d3, black now gets the program underway on the king side with h5. After a takes b, white starts to passively defend on the king side with rook f1, h4, and now black decides, white decides he needs to remove the knight on f4. However, note that passive retreat with bishop f2, g4, just simply looks like all systems go for the black team. So back to the game. After h4, bishop takes f4, black now plays g takes f4, opening the g file. The g2 point in particular is very sensitive. White decides to flee with his king. Black simply protects his e5 pawn and prepares to triple on the half-open file. After rook h1, black very alertly sacrifices his h-pawn to simply guarantee that the file is open. After g takes h3, rook at f to g8, white could find nothing better than continuing to flee. Let's see, if he contests the file with rook to g1, well, black does exchange one pair of rooks, but then throws in queen h4 check. After king f1, queen h3 check, king f2, queen h2 check, black wins the rook, end the game. So, going back to black doubling rooks, white decides to flee. Black now penetrates to the 7th rank, and after bishop e2, plays the tactic bishop takes e4. This piece sacrifice exposes the white king and secures black a passed pawn after f takes e4. If queen takes d7 instead, one way would be rook d8, and then on queen b5, queen h4 check, king f1, and queen f2 mate. So going back to the piece sacrifice, bishop takes e4, f takes e4. And what's interesting to note about the sacrifice with bishop takes e4 is that this wasn't, throw everything at him in the romantic style. This was actually the culmination of superior strategical play. So after white accepted with f takes e4, f3, another Tarrasch principle, the passed pawn's lust to expand. And we see that in full bloom here, as the bishop on e2 is simply overpowered. After bishop f1, Tarrasch now hitting with rook g1. This attacks the rook in the corner, and of course white resigned. After rook g1, the powerful f2 check, and we see again the pawn will promote on g1. A superb example by black, and again, the opening did become known as Alpen Sicilian for a while. He did play it in 2 games, however his results were rather mixed. In addition to the Russian master Alpen, who we just saw 2 games from, after e4, c5, c3, notable mention should be made of Aaron Nimzowitsch and Savily Tartakower, both who made considerable contributions to the development of the c3 Sicilian. Nimzowitsch used it in fabulous games against Chahis, Carlsbad 1911, which we will look at next, and later against Vidmar in the New York 1927 tournament. Tartakower played it against Rete and Kali in 2 games. The game Nimzowitsch-Chahis from Carlsbad 1911 continued. Knight c6, d4, already white has established the pawn duo in the center, cd, cd, and now d5. Now here, Nimzowitsch captured on d5. Trying to play for an advanced French in this situation would not do well for white, because after bishop to f5, black follows with e6, and he solved his major problem in the French defense, namely the development of the light-squared bishop. So after d5, white captures on d5. This pulls the queen out, but the white isolated pawn on d4 is under attack. However, after knight f3, e5 further opens the board. After knight c3, attacking the black queen, bishop to b4, pinning the knight. After bishop d2 breaking the pin, black now has a choice. Either move the queen or give up the bishop on c3 for the knight, which is what he does. And now bishop takes reinforces the pawn on d4 and threatens to capture on e5. Black now plays e4. Note, of course, that after e takes d4, knight d4, knight d4, queen d4, queen d4, bishop d4, white has a powerful, beautiful bishop for the endgame on d4. Attacks both g7 and a7. White has a clear, perceptible advantage in this type of position. Therefore, black plays e4 and tries to keep the bishop on c3 locked in behind its pawn on d4. White, of course, continues forward with knight e4, threatens to play bishop to c4. After knight takes e5, d takes e5, knight e7, we reach one of the critical theoretical positions for the c3 Sicilian. White has the 2 bishops. The pawns on e5 and e4 for both sides can potentially be a bit weak. White in this position has queen e2, bishop e2, and the move played in the game, queen a4 check, as methods to try and exploit or create an advantage. Nimzowitsch played queen a4 check. After bishop d7, he then dropped his queen back to a3, taking control of the a3 f8 diagonal. Black now played in very enterprising fashion. He played e3. A later game with Kramnik And Piquet from Monaco Rapid Tournament 1995 saw bishop to g4. But after h3, bishop h5, g4, e3, rook h2, white had a very definite advantage and went on to win the game. In our present game, after e3, black is hoping for f takes e3 and then queen e4 with some pretty juicy counterplay. The e3 pawn is hanging with check, the knight might pop up to d5, queen h4 check might be on the agenda, the g2 pawn is under attack, so it makes it difficult to develop the bishop. So we can see that e3 was a very alluring move. Nimzowitsch, however, plays f3 and maintains the integrity of his pawn structure. After queen e6, rook d1, black now plays knight f5. White played bishop d3, and after queen g6, the white pawn on g2 is under attack. White castled, and now black played an interesting idea. e2. This pawn sacrifice is a combination pawn fork and clearance and deflection. It deflects white bishop from d3, which is pinning the knight. It also clears the e3 square for the black knight, which we see after bishop takes e2, knight to e3. This looks very promising for black. He threatens queen takes g2 mate, and he knight forks both of the white rooks. Black does in fact appear to be doing quite okay here. However, Nimzowitsch had seen a bit further, and now plays king up to f2. We have to remember the king is a very valuable attacking and defensive unit. After knight takes d1, of course note, queen takes pawn check, simply king takes knight, leads black nowhere except a piece down. After king f2 attacking the knight, knight takes d1, rook takes d1, white is basically sacrificed in exchange, but has a nice bishop and pawn for it, has beautiful control of the a3 to f8 diagonal, which is very annoying for black as it keeps him from castling. He also has his rook on the open file, and of course the pair of bishops. Today's modern master would consider that white has absolutely full compensation in this position, if not advantage in practical play. After queen b6 check, bishop to d4, again we can see black is actually the one who controls the dark squares. Queen back to e6, b3 prepares to bring the second bishop up to c4, and after bishop c6, bishop c5 ensures that black won't be castling anytime soon. Queen to f5. Note that taking the pawn on e5 simply opens the e-file, and this certainly cannot benefit black with his king still on e8. For example, after bishop c4, queen c3, bishop back to b4, queen c2 check, rook d2, queen back to g6, and now the powerful move queen a5. This threatens penetration with either queen e5 check or queen c7. And again, we can see the poor black king is simply hemmed in on e8. So going back to the game after bishop c5, queen to f5, Nimzowitsch now found the very clever queen back to c1. In theory, bishop to d6 may have been an absolutely stronger move, but queen c1 certainly was not bad. After rook d8, he sunk the bishop in on d6, again keeping the black king cut off and avoiding the exchange of rooks. After h5, bishop to d3 harassed the black queen, queen e6, and now queen g5. Very powerful move. He threatens bishop to f5. He also threatens the pawn on g6. If the pawn on g6 tries to go forward, then bishop to c4 picks up juice because the e7 square has to be guarded, and then probably a move like queen d7 has to be played, and then white simply inches in. Moves like queen f6 and on rook g8, probably a backing up discovered attack with a move like bishop back, attacking the queen, and when the queen goes over, a move like bishop takes pawn check, queen takes, and rook takes mate. So going back after queen g5, this powerful penetrating move, black played rook d7, protecting the very sensitive e7 square. Unfortunately, that did allow bishop to f5, zapping the queen against the rook. After rook takes d6, Nimzowitsch simply played e takes on d6. The threats are multiple. The queen is on pre, the d pawn is ready to advance, the g7 pawn is hanging. It's all over. After f6, he finished the game off with queen g6 check, queen to f7 trying to save his queen, but d7 check. Again, we see the power of the passed pawn. After bishop takes d7, note of course king e7, rook e1 check is just simply the end. And after d7 check, bishop takes, queen takes, black in fact resigned. Of course, king takes and rook takes d7 leaves white absolutely a full piece up. No point for black to play on. A very powerful performance by Aaron Nimzowitsch. In this game, we see a very important theoretical position which occurs after e4, knight e5, knight takes e5, d takes e5, and knight e7. Again, white has queen a4 check, as played by Nimzowitsch. Queen e2 is also possible, and bishop e2. White's tried all three of these in order to prove an advantage from this position. As we saw from the last game, Aaron Nimzowitsch had a great understanding of the opening for white, and was excellent at creating problems for his opponents. Nonetheless, his and Tartakower's views on the c3 Sicilian weren't taken all that seriously, and it was considered to be a bit of a drawish weapon. Even so, the third and fourth world champions, Capablanca and Alyakin, also contributed to the development of the opening. The next game we will look at, Jose Raul Capablanca against Moshe Cherniak from Buenos Aires, the Olympiad in 1939. This actually was arrived at by transposition from a Caro-Kann, but after d4, d5, ed, cd, c4, knight c6, we now get a familiar position. After knight f3, bishop to g4, we've reached a typical c3 Sicilian. After cd5, queen d5, bishop e2, e6. Now of course note, black cannot win a pawn with bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, attacking the queen on d5, and queen takes d4, of course, is a horrific blunder because bishop takes c6 is with check, followed by queen d4. But going back after bishop to e2, black has a number of continuations. e5 has been played, knight f6 has been played, but the most solid is considered to be e6. White now castles, and after knight f6, knight to c3, the black queen has to move. Queen a5, h3, putting the question to the bishop, and after bishop h5, a3, trying to take away the b4 square from the black pieces. Black plays rook d8, looking to immediately put pressure on the isolated white pawn on d4. Capablanca gains space on the king side with g4, and after bishop g6, now goes for space on the queen side with b4. Very ambitious play. Black would probably be well served to simply back it up, chill out with queen c7. Instead, after b4, black went in for bishop takes b4. After a takes b4, queen a1, queen to b3, this type of sacrifice is quite common for white. You sack the exchange in the corner, but the black queen can become something of a liability and prone to being trapped. However, black thought he'd calculated this and came up with a very nice tactic, rook takes d4. In fact, we can see, if knight takes d4, knight takes d4, attacks the queen, attacks the bishop, and after queen c4, black has the tactic queen takes c3. After queen c3, knight e2 check forks the king and queen and leaves black with two extra pieces. So it was clear that when black entered this, he was calculating and counting on rook takes d4 as his saving grace. Note also that bishop to b2 fails to simply rook takes b4. After queen takes b4, black has the counter desperado, queen takes f1 check, king f1, and knight takes b4, again emerging with an extra exchange, and a few pawns. So after rook takes d4, black appeared to be doing quite okay. However, Capablanca now played the very fine retort, bishop a3. Of course, this traps the black queen. White now had to rely on the deflection motif, bishop c2. But after queen takes c2, queen takes a3, the black queen has escaped, but also walked onto a fork square. In the game, black continued with queen takes b4. His best chance to salvage the situation would be rook takes g4 check, h takes g4, queen b4, and he has quite a few pawns for only one piece. Back to the game after queen b4, knight at f takes d4, knight d4, knight d4. Black now had to castle. Taking the knight on d4 loses very abruptly to queen c8 check, queen d8, bishop b5 check, king e7, and queen takes b7, when black still has problems. For example, if he plays knight d7, simply rook d1, piling on the pinned piece numerous times, and instead of knight d7, if he tries to duck with his king, then rook to the c file, and the powerful threat of rook c8 is very hard to meet. So going back to the game, after Capablanca took on d4, black castled. But, to his credit, he does have 3 pawns for 1 bishop. So now it becomes a struggle of the extra bishop versus the 3 black pawns. Rook to d1, knight to d5, bishop to f3. We can see the bishop immediately gets to work on this long diagonal. Knight to f4, the knight finds a nice home and attacks the pawn on h3, king h2, and e5. This secures one knight and attacks the white knight. However, it also weakens the king side and brings the white pieces closer to the king side. And this bishop is now firing in on this pawn. This rook is now on an open file. After g6, the white knight comes back. However, notice even Capablanca could have played a little more precise with rook to b1, queen a3, rook b3, and then on queen a4, the maneuver knight e7 check, king g7, and queen c3 would have been very powerful. The pawn on e5 is under attack, the pawn on b7 is under attack. This would have been a winning advantage for white very quickly. But back to our historical game after knight e3, knight back to e6. Black obviously is hoping to plant his knight in on the fat square on d4, but first things first, knight to d5 attacks the black queen. And also notice that it covers the vital f4 square. After queen a3, attacking the bishop on d3, rook d3, counterattacking the queen, and on queen a1, rook to d1, Capablanca gains time here by repeating moves. He now improves the position with queen d2, threatening the deadly queen h6. King g7 to guard the h6 square, but now queen e2. This keeps an eye on the pawn on e5 and keeps the knight from coming into d4. After f6, he's now managed to loosen the king position up a bit. He now plays queen e3. This threatens rook a3, followed by scoring the pawn on a7. After a6, rook back to d1, queen to b2. He now plays the retreat knight to c3, a very powerful move. This threatens rook to d7 check, trying to collect the pawn on b7. When white played knight to d4, rook to b1 came at the pawn from another angle. And in fact, after queen c2, bishop to e4, an open field queen trap. A nice game by the 3rd world champion, and one of the few examples of him playing the c3 Sicilian with white. The last game from our historical overview is a brilliancy by Alexander Alekhine. After e4, c5, c3, d5, e takes d5, queen takes d5, d4, knight c6, knight f3, bishop g4, bishop e2, cd, cd. Like Capablanca, we see Alekhine play with the isolated queen pawn with white. After e6, knight c3, bishop to b4, pinning the knight. White castles. Black has a choice. He can capture the knight on c3 or move his queen. In this game, Black elected to move the queen, thinking he's attacking on c3. Here, Alekhine played what he became quite known for, a pawn sacrifice, a3, inviting white to capture twice on c3. In fact, after bishop c3, bc3, we can see that queen c3 is very dangerous. Bishop d2 attacking the queen. After queen b2, rook b1, queen a3. White could simply capture on b7 with very good compensation, or after queen a3, could play knight e5. Typical variation in Alekhine style would be bishop e2, queen e2, and if black takes the second pawn, with knight takes d4, queen c4 gives white all of the open lines and a tremendous attack. The knight on d4 is under attack, bishop to b4 possibly is threatened, rook takes b7 is threatened. This is very typical of Alekhine's dynamic style. In fact, after bishop c3, bc3, Garry Kasparov's boyhood hero was Alexander Alekhine. He loved his beautiful combinations and analyzed quite a few of his games, and in this position Garry suggested that black should simply play knight at gd7 with a small advantage for white. Two bishops, hanging pawns versus black's position. But in the game after a3, black played knight to f6. And now Alekhine showed his very fine ability to do deep calculation. He played the brilliant pawn sacrifice d5. This totally opens up the board to expose the black position, since he's not castled yet. Alekhine points out that if the immediate a takes b4 exchange sacrifice, similar to what we saw in the Capablanca game, queen takes a1, queen to b3, again, similar motif, bishop takes f3, bishop to e3, immediately attacking and trapping the queen, queen takes f1, bishop f1, and now bishop d5, black can head for a barricade. Alekhine pointed out that after knight d5, b5, and knight at cd7, followed by castles, black has good chances of successfully defending himself, and in this situation does actually have two rooks for the queen, plus very powerful barricade square on d5. Therefore, in this position after knight f6, Alekhine found the fantastic resource d5. The point here is black has two ways to capture on d5. After knight d5, e takes d5. Part of the motif with d5 is that it was a clearance sacrifice to make the d4 square available. After knight d4, bishop e6, white has the rotating maneuver knight to b3. This attacks the black queen, defends the rook on a1, and simply prepares a takes b4, snagging the bishop. That was a large part of the whole calculation with d5. So this d5 pawn sacrifice, black decided to take with a pawn. But now Alekhine captures the bishop on b4, and after queen takes, has sacrificed the rook in the corner, very, very similar to what we saw in the Capablanca game. But now he follows up with knight to d2. This exposes the bishops on each other and prepares knight to b3, trapping the queen. After bishop takes e2, queen takes e2 check, knight to e7. Note that king f8, knight to b3, queen a6, only square, b5, queen b6, pinning the pawn to the loose knight on b3, knight a4, knight d4, white has a very subtle queen back to d1, and after queen takes b5, knight d4, white has a winning position. So going back to queen e2 check, black decided to interpose his knight on e7 and sets the trap. After rook e1, he simply castles. Note that queen takes e7 runs afoul of rook e8. Again, motif we saw earlier, pinning the queen to the rook and taking advantage of white's back rank. However, Alekhine had seen this a bit further, and after castles, he now continued with his knight rotation maneuver, knight to b3. Again, pseudo-trapping the queen on a1. The queen has only one square, and the difference is he is able to exchange queens first, and then capture the knight on e7. So if we take a look at the material count, white has 5 pawns, and black has a rook and 2 pawns for a bishop and a knight. So materially speaking, black's doing okay, however, the white pieces are very active, and the black pawns are very, very weak. Black plays rook to b8, trying to get counterplay against the pawn on b4. Alekhine alertly plays b5, closing the b file to minimize the activity of the black rooks. And after a takes b5, he now plays rook takes a7. So now we see black only has a rook and 1 pawn for the 2 white minor pieces. After b4, knight e2, we see that the d4 square beckons to the white pieces. After rook at f to c8, f3 takes away the e4 square, prepares to advance the king, rook a8, rook takes, and king f2. One of the things that made Alekhine a powerful player in his time was fantastic technique. Knight d7, knight f4, attacking the pawn on d5. After knight b6, notice he doesn't rush with bishop to e3, but instead brings his king into the game. After rook c8, preparing to penetrate to c2, he simply slides over with king d3. Black now recklessly weakens himself with g5, and after knight h5, realized he has good chances of simply losing another pawn and resigned. Again, a nice little brilliancy by Alekhine, the isolated queen pawn and the very thematic, beautifully calculated d5 pawn sacrifice is what made this game particularly notable. This game was a big favorite of Garry Kasparov's. He loved the dynamic play that black Alekhine, the 4th world champion, showed in this game. We will now look at some of the plans and strategies, a bit of an overview if you will, for both sides. After e4, c5, c3, of course d5 is the most popular, and knight to f6 is probably second most popular. We will look at plans associated with d5. There's also the move order to g6, and after d4, cd4, cd4, d5, white pretty much has to play e5 if he hopes to try and achieve an advantage. Note that instead of e5, e takes d5, knight f6 transposes to a branch of the Panov-Botvinnik-Caro-Kann that's not considered particularly dangerous for black. Basically, black will recover the pawn on d5 and have comfortable development for his pieces. However, there is one interesting idea. After g6, d4, cd, cd, d5, knight c3 is a very interesting gambit. We'll look at a few games played with that. The idea is that after d takes e4, bishop to c4, white goes for active development, and on bishop g7 now plays queen b3, focused in on the f7 pawn. After e6, something like knight g2, and then on knight e7 or knight f6, white looks to blast open the position with d5. Very logical play. We'll look at a few games along these lines. Going back, after c3, there's also g6, the more subtle knight to f3, and on bishop g7, d4, cd4, cd4, d5. Now you can play e5. And the point is, black has wasted a tempo with his bishop, and it's not clear the bishop is so great on g7 in these type of positions. One of the better plans for white against this setup is to have the flexibility to play his knight at b to d2. For example, on bishop g4, had a recent game with Bechesera with bishop b5 check, knight c6, and now he played the very nice bishop takes on c6, b takes c6, and then knight at b to d2. White had very nice coordination, and I experienced some opening problems as black in that game. Going back after c3, another idea for black is to play e5, as we saw in the Saint Amant game earlier in our history section. And again, as I mentioned there, white's best approach is a modest positional approach with knight f3, attacking the pawn on e5, after knight c6, simply taking what the opponent gives you, in this case a beautiful diagonal from c4 to f7. Black now has to spend more time with queen c7, because if knight f6, knight g5 is a bit awkward, and so after queen c7, white should simply castle. After knight f6, knight to g5, pressuring the pawn on f7, and the point of queen c7 is now that black is able to drop back with knight d8 and defend his vulnerable point on f7. However, white can go ahead and blast open the f-file with f4, and after h6, knight back to f3, and if e takes f4, e5 offers white very good chances for the initiative. After c3, instead of d5, another possibility for black is to play d6. The idea here is that after white establishes his pawn duo on d4 and e4, black now looks to play knight f6 and counterattack in the center. His plan, if allowed, is to play knight c6, g6, and bishop g7, sometimes following with bishop g4 if the white knight pops out to f3. White's plan, though, is to play knight f3, h3, and castle, and just simply maintain the pawn duo and enjoy good prospects in the middle game. After d6, d4, knight f6, bishop d3, we will see a few games. White's play knight e3 and f3 leads to kind of a same-ish or maybe a Yugoslav attack formation versus the Dragon Sicilian. He will follow with bishop e3, and then depending on how black plays, he may castle kingside or complete his development and castle queenside. We'll see a few Sveshnikov games with this type of formation. After d6, d4, knight f6, f3 was also played in a few games by Sveshnikov. However, he eventually realized that knight c6, knight e2, bishop d7, bishop e3, e6 seems fairly okay for black. And then finally, after c3, we come to the French defense formation with e6. After d4, d5, white has two choices. One, as we already saw in a few games, is to play e takes d5, but Sveshnikov believes white's best chance for an advantage is to play e5 and play the advanced variation of the French. In principle, I suspect he may very well be right. In the French defense, the black bishop on c8 is impeded by its pawn on e6, and this is always a problem. With e5, white does gain more space on the king side, and Sveshnikov has played some beautiful games in that type of variation. After e4, c5, c3, d5, e takes d5, there's quite a number of ways the game can go. Almost invariably, black retakes with a queen on d5, but let's take a quick look. Suppose black plays knight f6. Well, you could play d4, and after cd, cd, again you get the Cairo-Khan position we discussed earlier, which is not problematical for black. But after knight f6, you could also throw in queen a4 check, just to disrupt black's plans. The other possibility is you could also play bishop to b5 check, and after bishop d7, simply capture on d7, queen d7, and then play c4. White has an extra pawn, black has to prove he has the goods. At some point, black will have to play e6 and make a real pawn sacrifice out of it, and after de, fe, note that queen takes, queen e2, you're already exchanging queens, and after f takes e6, knight f3, black has some compensation for the pawn, but basically black is about half a pawn down. Going back, after d5, e takes d5, invariably most players will play queen takes d5, and that leads us to the heart of the matter. Now, we did discuss earlier black sometimes likes to play g6, and knight f3 is a very good weapon to play against players that you know like the g6 formation for black. For example, after g6, you have the clever knight a3. This prepares both knight to b5 and bishop to c4 with a tempo. After bishop g7, bishop c4. Now, if queen e4 check, bishop e2, and for example, knight f6, castles, castles, d4 opens the board, and after cd4, knight d4, the black queen on d5 and e4 is suddenly exposed. For example, after queen d5, bishop to f3, queen d7, rook e1 was already very good for white in the game Sveshnikov-Miedzi's Latvia 2005, which we will take a look at. After rook d8, bishop f4, white had very nice development. After queen d5, knight f3, g6, knight a3, bishop g7, bishop c4, queen d8 also did not work out well for black. After d4, cd, queen b3, hitting f7, e6, knight takes d4, white had a very nice lead, and that's the game Sveshnikov-Panchenko from 2005. We will also take a look at that. Other ideas after queen d5. On knight f3, black can transpose into normal lines with moves like knight f6, e6, or knight c6. In all of those cases, white should just continue with d4, leading to normal type positions. After, say, e6 or knight c6, d4 leads to normal type play. After queen d5, d4, g6, another option for white is simply d takes c5. Sveshnikov mentions this is probably a little better for white, and Fritz also concurs. Black has two choices. He can either exchange queens on d1, and then he has to worry about recouping the pawn on c5, or he can take with the queen on c5, but then his queen gets bounced around after bishop to e3, queen to c7. White could simply play knight a3, already threatening knight to b5. Fritz also shows a tactical idea after bishop a7, rook a7, queen d4, very unusual. You see two rooks getting forked right out of the opening. This is a bit unclear though, and some players might not like for white to be attacked after knight c6, queen h8, knight f6. However, after knight d2, Fritz claims that white is just simply clearly material up and better. Again, after queen d5, d4, now if black opts for g6, you can also just play knight f3, bishop g7, knight a3, and after c takes d4, the very clever bishop to c4 with a tempo on the queen. And this is the clever part. After queen e4 check, you have the fantastic resource bishop to e3, putting the bishop where it can be captured by the black pawn. However, a nifty trick is that if d takes e, you have bishop takes f7 check. And note, of course, king takes allows the knight to g5 fork trick. And what's sweet about this is after king f8, you then have queen d8 check, forcing him to take the bishop, and then you get in knight to g5 check. So what this means is that after the clever bishop to e3, black probably has nothing better than knight h6, looking to swing the knight to f5. You then play c takes d4, and after castles, bishop g4, bishop h6, rook e1, led to a clear advantage for white. Small, but clear advantage for white in the game Sveshnikov-Nair, St. Petersburg, 1998. We will definitely take a look at that game. Going back, after queen d5, d4, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, knight a3, c takes d4, bishop c4, black also has the retreat queen back to d8, but this is a bit passive and doesn't really fight for the initiative. In fact, white can try to whip up some initiative with queen to b3. Familiar motif, trying to power down on f7. After e6, knight takes d4, knight e7, bishop g5, h6, bishop back to e3, knight d5. Another thematic type pawn structure that we can get is bishop takes d5, giving black the isolated pawn. This offers white very good prospects for a minimal but solid and safe advantage. This was in fact the game Sveshnikov-Zvitan from the Tilburg Rapid Tournament 1993. After queen takes d5, d4, e5 is another way to go for black. However, here d takes e5 is probably the simplest way to go. After queen takes d1 check, king takes d1, black experiences difficulties recouping the pawn on e5. For example, knight c6, you have either f4 is good, or 7 bishop to f4, as played in a game in 2004 between Ehrenberg and Chernysuk. After bishop g4, bishop e2 castles, knight d2, bishop e2, king e2, knight e7, simply knight f3. And on knight g6, bishop g3, rook e8, I very much like what white did in this game. He simply ducked with king d1. And when it was time to recoup the pawn with knight takes, bishop, knight takes, rook e1, put the pin on the e-file. And what this meant was that after bishop d6, knight e4, black experienced problems and was under pressure. So going back, after queen d5, d4, e5, d takes, black can also play queen takes e5 check. However, here he has weaknesses in the center, his queen is exposed early, and after the simple bishop e3, knight f6, knight f3, white has clear prospects for rapid development and a bit of an initiative. The black queen has moved around a lot, the black king is still in the center. So going back again, queen d5, d4. There's also the version where black exchanges pawns on d4 with cd4, cd4, and then tries to liquidate with e5. Here, knight f3, e takes d4, queen takes d4, queen d4, knight d4. We reach a very theoretical type position where white is about a tempo and a half ahead. Black has to be careful. If white gets in bishop to b5 check or knight to b5, it could be awkward, followed by rapid castles and rook to the e-file. There we will look at the game Pavasovich Makapani from the List Olympiad 1998. White played a beautiful game with the two bishops, and later with the outside passed a-pawn. Going back again after queen takes d5, d4, cd, cd, and e5, there's also knight f3, knight c6, maintaining the tension in the center and putting pressure on the d4 pawn. Here, after knight c3, bishop to b4, bishop d2, bishop c3, e4. If you remember, this is a position we saw in the historical overview. After knight e5, knight takes e5, d e5, knight e7. This was the famous Nimzovich-Chahis game. I believe this type of position definitely offers white chances for an advantage. Going back again after queen d5, d4, there's also the solid e6 type move. Now, if you play e6 without exchanging on d4, sometimes that gives white the added option of playing c4. In this situation, after e6, there's knight f3 followed by bishop e2 is a normal plan. There's also the clever knight a3. Here, after c takes d4, knight to b5 offers white some chances for the initiative. Again, after queen takes d5, d4, e6, knight a3, there's knight f6. You could now play bishop e3, trying to clarify the situation in the center by possibly threatening simply to capture on e5. After cd4, knight b5 again threatens the fork. And after knight a6, queen takes d4 is very nice, because after queen d4, bishop d4, white has a very pleasant endgame with immediate pressure on the pawn on a7. After b6, in the game Sveshnikov-Novikov, white played bishop to e2 and brought the bishop to f3 and had very nice pressure. As Sveshnikov himself pointed out, the immediate a4 is also quite possible, immediately planning to put more pressure on the queen side with a5. So again, this is an important plan to remember. After knight a3, bishop e3, the idea after cd4, knight b5, knight a6, the black knight guards the fork on c7 but is not so well placed on a6. But queen d4, playing for this type of endgame, is very promising and very low risk for white. After queen takes d5, d4, knight c6, a more aggressive plan for black as he puts pressure immediately on the d4 pawn. White could play d takes c, queen d1, king d1, but after e5, black has very rapid development. b4, a5, bishop b5, bishop d7 offers black full compensation for the sacrificed pawn. After queen d5, d4, knight c6, white probably would do better to continue with just knight f3. And then we have a couple of different themes. One is e5. Here, white could just try knight at b to d2, maybe even offering a pawn sacrifice just to continue accelerating his development. Is an interesting idea. Another idea is to go ahead and accept the pawn on e5, and after queen takes, king takes, bishop to g4, simply knight at b to d2. After knight e5, h3, bishop takes, knight takes, and castles, king c2, knight f3, gf3, the white double pawns are more than offset by the powerful bishop, and bishop c4 attacking the pawn on f7 is coming quick. Again, after queen d5, d4, knight c6, knight f3, e5, white can also go in for knight takes e5, knight e5, de5. In this variation, after queen takes, king takes, it's much harder because f4 will allow white to absolutely hold on to his extra pawn. So therefore, after queen e5 check, bishop e3, bishop d7, knight a3, castles, and queen f3, white has good prospects for an advantage, as we will see from the game Kramnik-Polgar Paris Rapid Tournament 1994. After queen d5, d4, knight c6, knight f3, there's also bishop g4 instead of e5. Here, white may very well consider d takes c5. After queen d1, king d1, castles, Sveshnikov considers this position to be slightly better for white. You could either play king over to e1 or possibly king to c2. Or simply interpose on d2. After queen d5, d4, knight c6, knight f3, bishop g4, there's also, instead of d takes c5, the simple bishop e2. And now, black probably needs to exchange on d4, because after e6, h3, bishop h5, c4 offered white a serious initiative in the game Short Judith Polgar 1995 and Ratchik Rinderman Istanbul 2003 and Strapunski Liu Las Vegas 2002. In all of those games, black did not score well. Going back to queen d5, d4, knight c6, knight f3, bishop g4, bishop e2, a very thematic type position. Castles was also played by black in the game Strakanovic Ivanovic, Sveshnikov Vatrasevich, and Sachs Pergel, and Markovich Milovic. And all of these games led to very sharp, exciting play. After queen d5, d4, knight c6, knight f3, bishop g4, bishop e2, there's also c takes d4, where black plays against the isolated pawn, as we saw in the Capablanca and Alyekin games earlier. After c takes d4, e6, knight c3, bishop to b4, castles, probably we could evaluate that this particular position with the isolated pawn is slightly better for white. Black has to either capture the knight on c3 or move his queen, as we saw in the Alyekin game. After queen takes d5, there's also d4, knight c6, knight f3, knight f6, and then bishop to e3 is an interesting move, trying to encourage clarification in the center. After cd4, cd4, e6, knight c3, black could retreat his queen. And then after a3, play is very similar to the Sima-Tarrasch. Saw many games in the Kamsky-Karpov match from 1996 played like this. There's also queen d5, d4, knight c6, knight f3, knight f6, and then d takes c5 in this position. Here, after queen takes c5, knight a3, knight g4, threatening f2, queen e2, bishop to f5, white has h3. And this seems to offer white a slight advantage. Note here that bishop takes bishop to d3 doesn't really do much for black, because after check, king over, rook d8, white simply sacrifices the queen and receives oodles of material after pawn takes. Going back, after queen takes d5, d4, knight c6, knight f3, knight f6, dc5, queen c5, knight a3, bishop g4, bishop d6 offers, after queen a5, queen b3, very good chances for the initiative. The black queen side notices that the bishop is missing and the b7 pawn is quite exposed. In fact, after bishop takes f3, gf3 castles, white doesn't even bother taking the pawn on f7, but instead, bishop to b5 cuts off the black queen and threatens to fracture the black pawn formation. After queen d5, d4, knight f6, knight f3, Garry Kasparov played like this with black. He played bishop g4. And on queen a4 check, bishop to d7 seems quite okay for black. After queen b3, cd4, bishop c4, queen e4 check, king f1, e6 offers white compensation for the pawn, but no more. After queen d5, d4, knight f6, knight f3, bishop g4. The choices are d takes c5 is very interesting for black and offers some chance for an advantage. There's either queen takes c5 or queen takes d1. King d1, e5, and now b4 trying to hold on to the queenside pawns. This offered white some advantage in the game Roland none, and Sveshnikov also believes it might be better for white. After queen d5, d4, knight f6, knight f3, bishop g4, bishop e2, e6, h3 is a promising way to play for white. Note that after castles, knight c6, bishop e3, cd, cd, bishop to b4 was an interesting move played by Garry Kasparov against Deep Blue in Philadelphia, 1996. And after a3, retreated the bishop to a5, and theory considers the bishop might actually be better placed on b6. In fact, after knight c3, queen d6, black had completely equalized this game. Going back after h3, bishop h5, castles, knight c6, bishop e3, white may have some chance for an advantage. Black could also play c takes d4, and after knight d4, bishop e2, queen e2, knight d4, bishop d2, bishop c5, rook d1, castles, knight a3, white had a definite lead in development in the game Sveshnikov, Sokolov, Elista 1996. After bishop d4, rook d4, queen a5, rook a d1, rook d4, rook d4, white had a clear advantage. In similar fashion, after c takes d4, knight d4, bishop e2, queen e2, knight d4, bishop d4, bishop e7, rook d1, the black queen had to move. After queen c6, knight d2, castles, queen c4, Smyslov, in a game against Zuchin, offered a queen exchange. The endgame has the 3-2 queenside majority, which we will look at, is slightly more favorable for white and has zero risk. In that particular game, white got a clear advantage but failed to actually win the game. After c takes d4, white has two promising plans. There's knight takes d4, or, as we saw before, c takes d4, taking on the isolated pawn. So that should give you a pretty clear overview, after queen takes d5, of the various plans for both sides associated with the isolated pawn or associated with playing for an endgame where you have the 3-2 queenside majority. In the c3 Sicilian, after d5, ed5, queen takes d5, and d4, often after d takes c5, or in cases where black plays c takes d4 and white takes the queen and we exchange queens, white often gets the 3-2 queenside majority. In his day, Stein had singled out the queenside majority as a very important positional element. it's interesting to consider how this advantage should actually be exploited. Using the lead in development, white can often start pushing his pawns on the queen side and exchange as many pieces as possible. Black's counterplay, on the other hand, after d takes c5, is often linked to the advance of his e and f pawns. If he is unable to do that, it's quite often he will sink into a passive position and simply lose the game without much effort. In this section, we will look at the hidden weapon in the c3 Sicilian, which is basically the queenside pawn majority. The first game in this section will be Viktor Glatman versus Vladimir Bobolovich. And even though the game was played in Moscow 1964, quite a while ago, I consider this to be a very instructive textbook example on how to play the position with white. Play continued, e6, knight f3, knight f6, knight a3, and after c takes d4, knight to b5, threatening the fork. With knight a6, again, as we mentioned earlier in the overview, the knight on a6 defends against the fork, but the knight on a6 itself is not particularly well placed. After queen takes d4, here we see the offer to exchange queens. Now, rather than exchange queens right away, black in this game throws in bishop c5. But after queen d5, knight d5, white begins his expansion on the queen side right away with b4. Now myself, I might prefer a slower method, a3, with more of a view towards playing c4. After c4, I would have deprived all of the pieces of the b4 square, and I might follow with the b4 pawn advance. Same general idea, I would just prefer a3 as being a more solid approach to executing the plan. Note here that after a3, bishop d7, knight e5, threatening to capture the bishop pair is very smooth, very convenient for white. Okay? But, again, our game was played in 1964, and Glatman, playing white, played the immediate b4. After bishop e7, he now played a3. Black castled, unaware of the danger. What black should do is he should play knight at a to c7 and resolve this issue of this weak knight on the edge of the board. After castles, white set his pawns in motion with c4. Black played knight at d to c7. We will later see a game with bishop f6, rook a2, knight c3, knight c3, bishop c3, and bishop d2. Again, in that position, white also has the queenside pawn in motion, and the knight on a6 is not great. Coming back after c4, knight back to c7, knight to c3. I very much like this. White escapes the influence of the inferior black pieces. When you have the space advantage, avoid exchanging pieces. This was a key principle from Sicilian Tarrasch. After bishop to f6, bishop to b2, b6, castles, bishop to b7. Now it's true black has managed to develop his queen side, but there's development and then there's useful development. The knight on a6 does not represent useful development and is actually redundant with the knight on c7. And even the knight on c7 does not have great prospects. White simply continued with bishop e2, threatening to possibly power into the 7th rank. After rook at a to c8, king c2, the king nudges forward. Knight back to b8, black starts to get his knight back into the game. Rook d2, preparing to double on the file, and knight c6, and rook at h to d1. White has managed to develop all of his forces. Another common theme when you have the queenside pawn majority is that you do want to exchange pieces, especially rooks. The more pieces you exchange, the more potent the queenside pawn majority becomes, as you can create a passed pawn. After knight e5, white simply exchanged knights, and after bishop takes, his two pawns on h2 and g2 are under attack, simply g3. After bishop f6, king up to b3. rook at f to e8, and now knight a4, offering to exchange bishops. Black retreated the bishop with bishop e7, but then bishop e5 and f6 and bishop d6. By exchanging bishops, white creates a square to penetrate on d6, but also gains control of the c5 square. After king f7, knight came back to c3, and after bishop c6, white now played in a very instructive manner that's not at all intuitively obvious. He advanced the b-pawn. The rule of thumb is that normally the candidate, or the pawn that will become a passed pawn, is the one that you would normally advance. However, white calculated very nicely that by advancing the b-pawn, at a later date he would be able to overpower the c5 square thanks to his space advantage and execute his c5 advance, thus creating a passed pawn. Very well done indeed. After bishop b7, a4, rook at e to d8, he now exchanges a pair of rooks and a pair of bishops. After king takes, now a5 is a very powerful stroke indeed. If b takes a5, simply rook a2 recovers the pawn, and the c-pawn has become a monster passed pawn. After a5, black finally got his e-pawn in motion with e5. But ab6 created a target on b6. After knight a4, black only has one unit that can go to defend the pawn, and that's right, putting the knight in the corner. But now king b4, and we can see that the king is in fact a very useful attacking piece. I would estimate that the king is worth about 3.5 points in terms of attacking power. After rook c7, c5, white's plan is realized. He now turns his 2-to-1 majority into a passed pawn. After bc5, knight takes c5, we can see the king, the knight, and the pawn threaten to overpower the defenders on the queen side. After knight to b6, he chops off one of the defenders, rook takes, and then penetration with the king. Beautifully done indeed. After rook b8, notice that knight d7 check, king up, rook check, king up, just simply leaves black in a terrible, terrible state with two pieces hanging. The threat is simply rook takes knight check. And note, the king is just really doing its bit. So after rook b8, the king continued on, king to c6, and after knight a4, king c7, and black, quite understandably, actually lost on time in this position. A few things I like about this game. White's very direct, straightforward use of his queenside majority. 2, the fact that black never really even had any play, never had a whiff of a chance at winning this game of chess. A textbook example on using the queenside majority. So let's do a quick recap of this beautiful example of using the 3-to-2 queenside majority. After c takes d4 by black, white played knight b5, threatening the knight fork, and after knight a6, then engineered the queen trade with queen takes on d4. Black, instead of trading queens right away, played bishop c5. White went ahead and exchanged queens, and then immediately expanded on the center with b4. With b4, bishop e7, a3, and after castles, c4, white immediately got his queenside pawns underway. Very, very instructive indeed. Another fine point is after knight c7, offering to exchange queens, knight to c3, escaping the influence of the enemy knights, leaving black with the poorly placed knight on a6, and also consistent with Tarrasch's principle, when you have a space advantage, you want to keep pieces on the board. Very nice move, knight to c3. Very important point to remember. Other important points is the early supporting role that we see with the white king. After castles, note how the white king starts to creep up the board with king c2. Later, with king b3, it lends added support to the pawn on c4, and further down the road, after b5, the king walked on up with king to b4 to help support the break with c5. After he created the passed pawn with c5, takes, knight takes, again we saw the king come on in to the position, and in fact in the final position it was the king that actually forced black to resign. Also very useful to note, going back, was how white broke in with his pawns into the position. The unusual advance b5, followed by a4, followed by a5. This left black after AB with a very weak pawn on b6, which he was able to exploit with knight a4, pacifying the black knight, and then king b4, followed by c5, creating a passed pawn. All in all, a very, very instructive game with some key elements that are worth noting. The next game in our in-game series that we will look at is played by the Grand Maestro himself, Evgeny Sveshnikov. This is played against Marat Makarov in a lista in the Russian Championship in 1994. e4, c5, c3, d5, takes on d5, queen takes, d4, knight f6, knight f3, e6, and now knight a3. Here, black voluntarily retreats with queen to d8, knight to c2, knight c6, and now bishop to f4. It took me a long time to appreciate the bishop on f4 controls a lot of vital squares on the queen side and creates discomfort for black, especially in the endgame. And part of the key, as Sveshnikov explains, is really controlling that e5 square and cutting down on black's counterplay. After c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight d4, queen d4, queen d4, knight d4. Now, especially we can see the bishop helps to control the e5 square, and that keeps the black e-pawn from advancing. White now threatens knight to b5, penetrating to c7 or to d6. Therefore, a6 is easy to understand. And now, bishop to e2. White's plan is very simple. He wants to finish development, centralize his rooks, bring the bishop to f3, and increase pressure on the black queen side. Black plays bishop d7, and now white castles. Sveshnikov himself mentions that bishop to f3 certainly deserves attention at this point, immediately putting pressure on the b7 pawn. But instead he castled, and after bishop c5, knight back to b3. After bishop to b6, he now started advancing his queenside pawns with a4. And after castles, he does mention knight to d5 as a possibility, and then bishop e5, f6, and then a5. Leads to very sharp play with good chances for an initiative for white. After a4 castles, he now played bishop f3. Black played bishop e8. A little bit strange, but after bishop c6, he simply trades, and on a5, note that bishop c7, bishop takes, king takes, knight c5 is very, very unpleasant for black. The pawn on a6 is going to need defending, and this is a very important thematic pawn structure, favorable pawn structure to keep in mind for white. For example, after rook a8, you now have a rook worth 5 defending a pawn worth 1. Not very efficient at all. After rook at f to d1, rook at h to d8, you could, for example, simply trade rooks. And after king takes, rook d1, king e7, and king f1, it's very clear that white is in charge in this endgame. Going back, after bishop e8, bishop to e5. Very nice move, which creates problems for black because of the weakness along the diagonal. After rook g8, a5, squeezing in on that side, and on bishop e7, rook at f to e1. As we said, white's plan is simple. Centralize the pieces. After knight d5, rook e4 was interesting, preparing a little lateral rook action. Bishop c6, and now rook c4 pinning the bishop. On knight e7, simply rook e1 centralizing the other rook. After bishop to b8, now knight d4, and he puts maximum pressure on the c6 bishop. After bishop e5, rook e5, black tries to escape with his king with king b8. The best defense would have been rook d6, keeping white's advantage to a bare minimum. Instead, after king b8, white now played bishop takes on c6, knight takes on c6, relying on the fact that knight takes c6 allows rook d1 with a back rank mate. However, Sveshnikov rose to the occasion with rook takes c6. The point being that after knight pawn takes on c6, knight c6 check, king b7, knight d8, rook d8, g4, and white has an extra pawn in the endgame. So going back after rook takes c6, black countered with rook takes d4, threatening mate on the back rank. And now, the fantastic rook at c takes e6. Connecting the rooks, black played rook d2. Note that rook check on d1 is no longer a back rank mate because the rooks are connected. So after rook d2, white now played rook e7. And after rook b2, black has managed to recover his pawn. However, after g4, white gets ahead in the pawn race and has a rook on the 7th rank. After f6, white now plays rook to d5, creating the possibility of doubling rooks on the 7th rank. After h6, rook to f7 was a very subtle move, freezing the black pawns on the king side. Black now erred with b6. After king a7, h4, white is far ahead in the race and has gained time. b6 was a mistake under pressure. White now played rook to d6, and I have to say it took me playing through this game a few times to appreciate all the subtle nuances that we're about to see in this double rook ending. My overall impression was that the player playing white is a very, very strong player and handled the position with a very firm grip. This to me is an extremely instructive game that bears playing through more than once. After b takes a5, rook takes a6. The pawn on a5 is under attack. Now note, material is still equal, but the white rooks are more active than the black rooks, especially the rook on g8. After rook b5, protecting his pawn, he now played rook to a7, both threatening the a5 pawn and threatening a possible skewer on the g8 rook. After rook c8, he now was able to snatch the pawn on g7. Also, incidentally, weakening the pawns on f6 and h6. After f5, black was able to exchange that pawn, but rook check, throw the king in the corner, and then rook takes h6, and because of the back rank mate, white has now snagged a second pawn. In the game, black actually resigned on move 57. After rook over, rook check, king b8, and now again the same maneuver, rook at g to a7. Very nice indeed. Threatens the a5 pawn and threatens to check and do the skewer bit. After rook takes f2, black recovered one pawn, but rook check, king up, rook takes, and rook a5, white has 2 pawns advantage with a clear technical win. In fact, after rook c8, rook check, king a6, and rook b3, black could have simply resigned. This is a very easy technical win for white at this point. Again, very impressive play by white, and let's take a quick recap. After c takes d4, exchanges, one pair of knights, and queen takes, offers a trade of queens. Black agreed to the exchange of queens, and after takes, knight takes, white already has a slight lead in the endgame in development. He's got a bishop and a knight out, he only has a knight. And because of the added threat of knight to b5 to c7 check, black has to spend another tempo to play a6. With bishop e2, the bishop relocates to f3 and puts pressure on the b7 pawn. After bishop d7, castles and bishop c5, the white knight maneuvers with knight to b3, bishop b6, a4, and bishop f3 put pressure on the black queen side. Later, active piece play with bishop to e5 and 20 rook to e4 offered white chances of maintaining the initiative. Rook c4 here was also very important. And then, in this position, with white fully centralized, the defensive error king b8 allowed bishop takes, knight takes, and rook takes. This little petite combinación netted a very nice, important pawn and initiative. After rook takes d4, rook takes on e6, rook d2, black actually was able to recover the pawn after rook e7, rook b2. However, g4 put white ahead in the race, and white had a rook on the 7th rank. Delicate play in the rook ending later, where he played this maneuver rook to a7, threatening the skewer, forced rook c8, and rook g7 netted one extra pawn. We saw the same theme later in this key position. White again used the same motif with rook back to a7, threatening the pawn on a5, and thus was able to liquidate down to a technical one ending. After rook f2, check, king up, rook takes, and rook takes a5, white achieved a technically winning ending. The final position with rook b3, he simply has two passed pawns, several files apart, and the black king is cut off on the a file. Again, a superb demonstration of excellent, strong, thematic piece play, keeping the initiative on the queen side, and then transferring that into very nice play in the double rook ending. Very powerful performance by Sveshnikov. Our next queenside majority endgame is another fine example by the Grand Maestro himself, Evgeny Sveshnikov, this time against fellow Grandmaster Andrei Sokolov, played in Moscow in 1991. Sokolov, by the way, at one time got to be in the top 10 or 15 or so in the world rankings. So it shows even the strongest players with black can have problems in the c3 Sicilian. e4, c5, c3, e takes d5, queen takes, d4, knight f6, knight f3, e6, bishop e2, knight c6, castles, bishop e7, and as we mentioned in the overview, the danger with playing e6 and leaving the pawn on d4 and not capturing on d4 is that white can try to strive for a bit of initiative with c4, taking advantage of the queen being on d5. After queen d8, here Sveshnikov goes for taking on c5, offering an endgame. After queen d1, rook d1, black now plays knight to e4 to recoup the pawn. He could play the immediate bishop takes, and after knight c3, castles a3, b6, b4, and again we can see the white queenside pawn majority is already underway. After bishop to e7, the key thing here to remember is not to put the bishop on b2, because the bishop belongs on b2 when you're trying to attack on the king side. And time again, it's very hard for me to remember the bishop belongs on f4. We're playing with our queenside majority. We don't want the bishop behind it. We want the bishop supporting the pawns. And controlling the e5 square is key. Again, in this position, not bishop to b2, which after b4 a lot of people would think is a natural move, but again, bishop to f4. This supports squares in front of the pawn and allows our rooks to come behind the pawns to support them. This led to a clear advantage for white in the game Sveshnikov-Serper, Pinsk, 1986. But back to our game at hand. After rook takes d1, black played knight e4, looking to recover the pawn, possibly with a knight. And this also keeps the white knight off of the active c3 square. After bishop to e3, bishop takes, the exchange of dark squared bishops appears imminent. But here, white played a very nice idea. Knight to d4. What this does is it frees the f3 square for the bishop and offers to exchange two pairs of minor pieces, which is what actually happened. After bishop d7, bishop f3, bishop takes on d4, knight takes on d4, knight takes, and rook takes, white has managed to exchange an extra pair of pieces. After knight f6, knight c3, castles, and rook at a to d1, the position has been greatly simplified. Black should now play e5, and after rook d7, king c7, with fairly reasonable chances. Instead, he played bishop c6, going for more simplification. After bishop takes, note that rook takes, bishop takes b7 check, intermezzo, nets a pawn and gives white virtually winning endgame. But after bishop takes c6, bc6, white exchanged off all of the rooks. So now we've reached a pure knight ending after only 19 or 20 moves. This knight ending is evaluated as equal, but in reality it's approximately equal, but not exactly equal. Why? Because black has 3 pawn islands. His pawns on the queen side are isolated and split. Now, these are not huge advantages, but white also has a little bit of a space advantage thanks to the c-pawn, and he does have the 3-2 queenside majority. So this accumulation of very small advantages offers white some chances with virtually no risk in this type of endgame. Let's see what happens. After f3, knight back to d7. Notice c5, white could already play knight b5, and on a6, knight to d6, and on king e7, knight to b7, attacking the pawn on c5, and after knight d7, notice the black pieces are boxed out. White simply plays king f2, a3, and b4 with a very, very clear advantage. So this little sample shows how easy it is to go wrong for black already. Why? Because he has an inferior structure. So instead of c5, which we could actually label as a mistake, black played correctly with knight d7. White starts to activate his king, and black starts to mobilize his central majority. After king up, king e7, b4, white gets his queenside pawns in gear, and after e5, a4, king d6, and king d3, and knight f6, black has played very logically. He's mobilized his e and f pawns, which in many games we've seen so far black has failed to do. He's centralized his king and his knight. However, white still has an advantage on the queen side and now plays c5 check. After king e6, played in the game, white struck with b5. But let's see. Instead of king e6, suppose black had retreated his king back to d7. Well, my analysis shows that after b5, note that king c4, a6 makes it hard for white to progress. Yes, he might get one passed pawn, but it'll be a c-pawn easily blockaded. Therefore, it's important to strike right away. Sveshnikov in his notes mentioned that he wasn't sure about knight to d5. But my analysis shows that after knight d5, cd5, f4 is a very important shot. After e4, check, king d4, this king and pawn ending to me appears to be winning. Why is this important? Why do I take time to study this? Because the endgame is your secret weapon to success in the c3 Sicilian. This type of winning ending because your pawns are advanced. They're further advanced. And as we will see in a king and pawn ending, this can make the difference between winning by a single tempo. A thematic variation would be h6, a5. And now, g5 or g6. Let's take a look. The result winds up being about the same in either case. The main point is white's pawns are further advanced. At one moment, he can release the black pawns and run in and try to mate the black king. How does this play out? After g5, a6 threatens to get a far advanced passed pawn, king c7, fg5, hg5, and g3. Note here now that on f4, we simply play gf, gf, and h4, and on f3, king e3, our king holds these pawns, while the black king will not be able to dance on both sides of the board. But let's go back. The real important variation here is instead of f4, if g4, trying to lock it up. White now wins with king e3, king d7, and then b6, creating a far pawn. After a b6, simply a7. And after b6, white simply gets a queen, as the black king can't get over. For example, king c8, pawn takes pawn, and the pawn queen's on the 8th rank. So let's go back. After king d7, b5, knight d5, we trade knights, and we hit him with f4. After e4, king up, h6, a5, and now let's take a look at g6. The way you win here again is you play a6, king c7, g3, and now you simply run black out of moves. After h5, his king has to abandon the b6 square. This is the critical square right here, b6. After king back to c8, we now get b6 in. And after ab, ab, cb, king over, we now play king takes on d5. After e3, king into d6, e2, hit him with a7 check. King b7, and it looks like black is okay. But we hit him with a8 queen, king takes, king c7, e1, and now everything's with check. b7 check, king up, b8 check, king up, and queen b6 mate. This is the critical motif. This is why the king and pawn ending in this situation would be winning. Okay? So going back after c5 check, king e6 was played, and now b5, creating a powerful passed pawn on the queen side. King d7 again, knight d5 allows simply knight d5, as we saw. King d6, losing to b6, a b6, c b6, king d6, a5, c5, a6, king c6, a7, king b7, and king c4, very similar to what we saw before. After e4, king c5, same motif, e3, king d6, fantastic move, e2, and again a8 check, the same photo finish like we saw before. Get a queen check, king up, and queen b6, again the same pattern. So after b5, king back to d7, king c4, a5, a6. Black tries to barricade in, but after b6 check, white has a monster passed pawn on b6. King b7, the black king is now tied for life to defending against the b pawn. g3, before relocating his knight into d6, white wants to control the f4 square. After h5, h4 now allows the h pawn to freeze two black pawns. After knight d7, f4, it's simply a matter of white breaking into the black position. After e takes f4, if e4, of course, simply king d4. The white knight threatens to come to e3, to c4, and into d6. So after f4, e takes f4, g takes f4, knight back to f8, knight to e2, knight to g6, it looks like black has managed to generate some counterplay. However, white has calculated everything out quite nice and plays knight to d4. In the game, he takes on h4. If he plays knight f4, you simply take, and on g6, knight e7 is zugzwang. The king can't move without losing the c pawn, the knight can't move without losing the g pawn. That is zugzwang. So going back after knight to d4, knight h4, knight into e6, with the dual threat of knight takes g7 and knight to d8 check, winning the c6 pawn. Of course, once you win the c6 pawn, these two pawns are absolute monsters. After king to c8, knight takes g7, it's now the white knight's turn to attack two pawns. After knight g6, knight h5, king d7, the white king now comes to defend the f4 pawn and relieve the white knight. After king c8, again, keep in mind the king has to stay close to the b pawn. King e3, and this is what we call role change. The white king takes over defending the f4 pawn, so the white knight is now free to go do other chores. After knight e7, knight g7, keeping an eye on the f pawn, knight d5 check, no problem. King over to f3 keeps everything defended. Knight has to go back to e7 to defend, and now the knight relocates. e6, and knight back to d4, attacking both pawns. At this point, black resigned. Why? After knight e7, the only move to defend both pawns, now the white king is free to come into g5 and overpower the f-pawn. King d7, king h4, king c8, king g5, followed by simply king d7 and knight takes f5, and it's all over. Let's do a quick recap after knight d4. So with d takes c5, queen d1, and rook d1, we reached an endgame. Again, slightly different pawn formation. The c-pawn has been advanced, but again, the same basic concept. 3 pawns versus 2 pawns on the queen side. In this position, instead of just simply exchanging bishops, white played the very nice idea knight to d4. This offered to trade 2 pairs of minor pieces and freed the f3 square so that our bishop could put pressure on the black queen side. After the exchanges took place and the knight retreated, note we develop. We don't grab the pawn on b7 because of rook b8. We have the pawn structure we want. We do not want to change the pawn structure. So instead, we develop our knight, and after castles, rook at a to d1, all of our pieces are centralized. We're ready to force the exchange of rooks down the f-file. Note that after bishop c6, we exchange, takes, we trade all the rooks, and we've reached what theoretically might be considered an equal endgame. However, white definitely has a bit of an advantage. Notice that white's technique, f3, then he brought the king up, and we reached this critical endgame where it seems that black has done everything right. He's advanced his pawns, he's centralized, but again, the important point, c5, king over, and b5, getting our queenside pawn majority going and creating a passed pawn. Very, very instructive play. The position does not look dangerous for black, but yet white has definite advantage, definitely has winning chances, and virtually no risk. Very, very professional performance by Sveshnikov. Our next example with the queenside majority is Duško Pavlović against Grandmaster Normundus Mises. This game was also played in Russia. And let's see, e4, c5, c3, d5, takes on d5, queen takes, d4, e6, knight f3. Of course, knight a3 immediately is possible. After knight f3, knight f6, knight a3, c takes d4. White zips up with knight to b5, and after knight a6, plays queen takes on d4, heading to the endgame. After queen takes d4, in this game, white took with the knight that was on b5. However, Sveshnikov in this position took with the f-knight. His logic is he keeps the f3 square is now available for his bishop to put added pressure on the queen side. What happened in his game with Mises, the same player from Riga 2005, was bishop e7, bishop f4, again controlling that important e5 square, and after castles, bishop e2, rook d8, castles, knight d5, bishop back to g3, and on bishop d7, he played bishop f3. Again, we see a little bit of a difference, and on bishop e8, black had severe problems. In fact, after c4, when the knight moved, bishop to b takes b7, black had his rooks trapped and lost the exchange and a pawn. White won in short order. That was the game Sveshnikov, Mises, Riga 2005. But back to our game. After queen takes d4, queen takes d4. Again, knight at f takes d4 might be stronger. Keep the f3 square available for your bishop. Keep your active knight on b5. But in our game at hand, after knight at b takes d4, bishop e7, bishop e2, white also had advantage because he's got the e5 square under control. After castles, castles, knight c5, this knight gets back into the act. After rook d1, rook d8, c4, white sets his queenside pawns in motion. After knight at c to e4, it's not clear where this knight is really going. Knight to e5 is played, and now bishop d7 just simply hands black the bishop pair. Probably more astute would have been to play knight to d7 to challenge the white knight. But after bishop d7, white chopped off the bishop and offered the exchange of rooks. With the bishop pair and the queenside majority, of course, white would love nothing better than to exchange all the rooks. After rook d1, bishop d1, black continued with knight c5, offering to exchange a pair of knights. This just continues to play into white's hands. Probably more relevant was to play rook c8, and after bishop e2, knight d6, at least try to generate a little counterplay against this c-pawn. After knight c5, white now put his bishops to work with bishop to f3, pressuring the b7 pawn. And after rook d8, the old indirect defense based on the back rank mate, bishop to e3, and suddenly both of the white bishops are powering in on the black queen side. In order to avoid losing a pawn, black played b6, bolstering in on the dark squares. However, the problem when you're fighting against the bishop pair, in this case, black erects a construction against the dark squares, but after knight to d4, we see the light squares, notably c6 is very weak. After knight to d3, attacking the b2 pawn, white chose to ignore it and popped on into c6, attacking e7, d8, and a7. After rook d7, white simply collected the second bishop with knight takes e7 check, rook takes, and now b3. Picture perfect position for white. He's got the two bishops and a 3-2 queenside majority. After rook to d7, he immediately set about putting the pawn majority to work with a4. After knight to c5, attacking the pawn on b3, he simply pushed that one as well. And after knight to b3, again, rook to d1. Remember, we said white would love nothing better than to exchange all the rooks. And after e5, king over, and king f8, he simply exchanges rooks, and now king e2. Again, what a beautiful position. Two bishops and 3-2 pawn majority on the queen side. Black played the reckless g5. I guess he was hoping for bishop g5, knight d4, but even this after king d2, knight takes, pawn takes really offers him no real hope. However, after bishop to d5, black is faced with two threats. Simply bishop takes on g5 or c5, attacking the knight and creating a passed pawn. In fact, after bishop to d5, h6, c5 is just absolutely crushing. After knight d4, bishop takes, pawn takes, c6, and on knight f6, c7, and it's a score at c8. After bishop d5, appropriately enough, black realized the situation was hopeless and resigned. Let's do a quick recap. Going back to the opening, after c takes d4, white employed the customary technique, knight to b5, threatening the fork, and on knight a6, queen takes d4, offering the trade of queens. After trading, taking with either knight makes sense. In this game, white took with the b knight and elected to keep control of the e5 square with this knight. After knight e5, black's bishop d7 was not too impressive because knight takes d7 simply gave white the bishop pair. After bishop to f3, the one bishop went to work, and on rook d8, bishop e3 put the second bishop pair to work. When black tried to barricade in on the dark squares with b6, knight d4 exploited the new weakness on c6, and after knight d3, knight c6, rook d7, knight e7 check secured the second bishop. White simply preserved his pawn with b3, and after rook d7, a4 set about attacking the queen side. On knight c5, b4, continuing the advance, and on knight b3, offering the trade of rooks. Simply finished any serious resistance. Again, a very good technical game to understand. The bishop pair, the queenside majority, winning advantage for white. In our next example of the 3-2 queenside majority, we see the godfather of the C3 Sicilian, Evgeny Sveshnikov, play another grandmaster, Igor Novikov. This was in Tallinn, 1988. Let's take a look. E4, C5, C3, D5, E takes D5, Queen D5, D4, E6, and now Sveshnikov, at the very first opportunity, flips the knight over to A3 instead of the customary knight to F3. After knight F6, we now see the new idea and the subtle difference. He plays bishop to E3, and here, by pressuring the pawn on C5, he hopes to encourage, as he does in this game, black to exchange immediately on D4. After C takes D4, of course, keep in mind it's very important not to allow bishop takes A3, fracturing our queenside pawns, but instead to play knight B5, threatening to fork the black king and queen. After the customary knight A6, queen takes D4, offers a trade of queens, and the difference being that after queen takes, white is able to recapture on D4 with the bishop. The bishop is beautifully centralized here. It controls the E5 square and also pressures the black pawn on A7. After B6, in the game Sveshnikov played bishop E2. He mentioned that he thought A4 immediately, threatening to play A5 and work on the B6 pawn, open the A file, might have actually been the strongest continuation. But bishop E2 is certainly a good move, and after bishop B7, he now contests the diagonal and offers a trade of bishops. And after bishop takes, knight takes, white has managed to develop another piece and exchange a pair of minor pieces. Keeping in mind Steinitz's principles when playing with a queenside majority is that you do want to exchange pieces. Ideally, you want to eventually get down to a king and pawn ending where you have the outside passed pawn, sufficient to win. After knight F3, black played knight to D5. White castled, and after F6, at least black is now fighting for control of the E5 square. White gets the queenside pawn majority underway with C4, and after knight at D to B4, threatens to go into C2 and get rid of the white bishop. White simply retreats his bishop, and after knight back to C6, plays knight at F to D4, offering to trade a second pair of minor pieces. After knight D4, bishop D4, king F7, white now plays rook at F to D1. Again, we can see white is a little bit ahead in development, has an aggressively placed knight on B5, the pawn on A7 is still under attack, and white does have his 3-2 queenside majority. Small, but cumulatively important advantages for the player of the white pieces. After bishop E7, bishop back to E3, opens the D file and threatens to penetrate. After rook at H to D8, white now exchanges one pair of rooks, and we notice that black is unable to capture because the pawn on A7 is still a liability. Therefore, after rook D8, bishop D8, white now swings over and takes over the D file. After king E7, A3 prepares to put the queen side in motion. After knight C7, offering the trade of knights, again a motif that we have seen before, escaping the influence of inferior enemy pieces, knight to D4. This avoids the exchange of pieces since black is the one under attack in a cramped position. It also highlights the weakness of the C6 square as we saw in an earlier game. After king E8, the knight goes ahead and pops on into C6, and we can see unassailable and attacking D8 and A7. After bishop E7, B4. White has managed to accumulate several advantages. More actively placed pieces, 3-2 mobile queenside majority. After knight A6, king F1, on a piece-by-piece basis, every white piece is superior to the black counterparts. Knight to B8, scurrying to try and offer an exchange, but now he simply takes the bishop. And after king takes, c5, forcing the creation of a passed pawn. White's play in this game is just textbook smooth. After b5, black now would like to play knight c6 and rook d8 with a draw. However, that requires time, and that's the one element that black is still behind in. So after c5, b5, white plays rook to d6, keeping the black knight off of the important blockading c6 square. Note that if he had exchanged on c5, you would not take with a pawn, but rather with the bishop check, and on king e8, again, rook d6, threatening this pawn on e6, and after e5, penetration with rook e7, rook e6 check, followed by rook e7. For example, king d8, bam, rook to the 7th, and we can see these pieces are over here, and these pawns are over here. This is going to be munchy on the king side. So after c5, black had to keep it locked up with b5, but then rook d6. Very nicely done. And after knight d7, rook c6, and then on a5, penetration with rook c7. The knight is pinned, the pawn threatens to go to c6. After king d8, rook b7, and again the pawn still threatens to advance, and the b5 pawn is under attack. And here, after a takes b4, white very nearly spoiled the fruits of his fine effort. He played c6. There was absolutely no rush. The simple a takes b4 leaves black with all the problems to solve. King c8, rook takes b5. Maybe he was concerned about rook to b8. However, after rook to b8, probably rook a7 and the threat of c6. If you play knight e5, then the king side gets wiped out, and on knight back, simply bishop back, and the king side is still falling apart. You'll just win on the other side of the board. So it's really not clear to me why Sveshnikov, who usually is quite patient, suddenly jumped the gun here in this position. Part of the explanation, though, is that Novikov was in time trouble, and maybe Sveshnikov wanted to force a knockout right away. Anyway, after c6, knight e5, rook takes g7, and I guess he was lured by the threat of rook check skewering the rook. Black now played rook a6, attacking the passed pawn, but what he actually missed was a huge opportunity here with b3. The point being that after rook check, king up, rook takes, this pawn goes in. White got back on track with c7, king c8, and a takes b4 with a winning position, and in fact, black resigned. So let's go back. In spite of the slight error at the end, this was a very instructive game. After e6, white took the first opportunity to swing the knight to a3. And we saw that after knight f6, the nice technique bishop e3, threatening to simply capture on c5, and after cd4, knight b5, threatening the fork, knight a6, queen takes on d4, a new idea. After queen d4, bishop d4, the bishop on d4 was very powerfully placed, covering the e5 square and pressuring the a7 pawn. After b6, the further maneuver bishop e2, and on bishop b7, bishop f3, exchanges again favored white. Skipping ahead with 22a3, and on knight c7, avoiding the exchange of knights was key. And after king e8, knight c6, followed by b4, it was all systems go for white. Better placed pieces, queenside majority, control of the file, a knight on the outpost, all around better. Note, black has yet to get any kind of serious counterplay going with the e and f pawns. When black tried to challenge his knight, he went ahead and captured the bishop, and then c5, securing a passed pawn. When black tried to lock it up, rook d6 was key, controlling the blockading square. And here, penetration with rook c6, a5, and rook to c7 should have proved decisive. After king d8, rook b7, a b4, the simple recapture a takes b4 gives white a winning endgame. Again, very, very instructive, and I really do like this idea of bishop to e3 and then taking with the queen on d4, and after the queen exchange being able to capture. This looks like a very promising endgame for white, very instructive. In this game between Drazen Cermak, a young Russian master who also plays the c3 Sicilian, and Grandmaster Enver Bukic, played in Bled 1992, we will see a similar endgame to the last one, except this time white plays the a4, a5 plan. Let's take a look. After e6, again, like Sveshnikov, white immediately plays knight to a3, exclamation point. After knight f6, again, immediately pops the knight up to b5, and after knight a6, employs the bishop e3 technique, threatening to capture on c5. After c takes d4, queen d4, queen d4, bishop d4, and b6, we have the same endgame as we saw in the last game with Sveshnikov and Novikov. In that game, Sveshnikov played bishop e2 to f3, certainly a good continuation, but even he said a4 might actually be stronger. Now, black defended with knight to d7. First point to note is that bishop c5, offering to exchange bishops, looks logical but fails tactically. To bishop takes c5, b takes c5, and now knight to d6 check. This really breaks apart the black defenses, because after king d7, knight c8, and we see the loose knight on a6 causes problems. In fact, after knight c7, white is somewhat fortunate that he's only going to be a pawn down after knight takes a7. Nonetheless, this is clearly good for white, almost winning in fact. Therefore, after a4, black decides to scurry back with knight to d7. White continued, very direct, very straightforward with a5. And after king d8, white developed with knight f3, now threatening to go knight to g5 and fork from the other side. f6 helps black to patrol the g5 and e5 squares, and now bishop to c4 zeroes in on a new weakness on e6. In the game, black just played bishop to b7 and abandoned the pawn on e6. If e5, bishop to d5 is an unpleasant news story, because after rook b8, bishop to e3, black is very hard pressed to defend the pawn on a7. And after pawn takes, simply rook takes, and white threatens just to play king up and continue piling on. And in fact, the immediate threat is simply to capture on a7. Very, very unpleasant, the whole situation for black. So going back after bishop c4, black decided in this game just to give up the e6 pawn. White took it, and after knight to c5, captured on c5, and after knight c5, black was hoping to get counterplay. Note, on bishop c5, castles attacking the pinned knight is very powerful. And after bishop c8, knight at f to d4 threatens knight c6 check, and after bishop takes, rook e8, the simple bishop d5, rook b8, and knight takes a7 just simply cleans house. So going back after bishop takes on c5, knight takes on c5, white castles with check. After king e7, white could simply retreat the bishop with bishop to a2, but instead, white played an inspired style with rook at h to e1. Now, without queens on the board, it's amazing the black king is under fire in the center of the board, the price for not having gotten castled. After knight e6, with knight c7, simply attacking e6 twice and attacking the rook on a8. After bishop takes f3, g takes f3, black could find nothing better than rook c8. Knight takes e6 allows white to recoup his piece and remain one solid pawn ahead. After king f7, rook d7 check, king g6, rook g1 check, king h6, white now helped himself to another pawn on the queen side. And after b takes a5, rook takes a5, we can see white is rewarded with 2 connected passed pawns for his efforts and still has dominant pieces. The knight on e6 is very powerful, the rook on g1, cutting the black king off. Black struggled on with g5, but f4 opens up the king position. And after bishop to b4, black gave it his best kamikaze effort. Notice that g takes f4, knight takes f4, simply sets up the rook h5 mating scenario. So after f4, black went for confusion with bishop to b4 based on the pin. White calmly captured on g5, and after f takes g5, rook at a to g5, black sacrificed a bishop with bishop c3 to eliminate the white queenside pawns. But after b takes c3, rook c3, and king d2, white was faced with the elimination of one more set of pawns. After king d2, rook h3, black threatened to eliminate the white h-pawn. White now played rook f5, and black resigned. The threat here is simply, if rook h2, for example, check, check, and mate. That's the threat. After rook f5, black could try some razzle-dazzle based on the stalemate potential of the black king. For example, he could play rook d8 check. But then, king e2, rook d2 check, you take that one, but then on rook d3, you don't take the second one. Note that king takes would be a double question mark because the black king is stalemated. See, no squares to go. That would be a sad, sad affair. But what you do is on rook d3 check, you simply sidestep with king e2, and on rook e3 check, again, you duck, and on rook e1 check, king g2 breaks the stalemate by allowing access to the g6 square. So let's go back. After rook f5, black resigned. What did we learn from this game? Again, the endgame with queen takes on d4, queen takes, and bishop takes d4, the powerful bishop on d4 attacks a7. In this game, white employed the powerful a4, preparing a5, just blasting open the queen side and working on the b6, a7 pawn complex. After bishop c4, the pressure was so severe that after bishop b7, bishop e6, white just captured a pawn on e6. After knight up, bishop takes, knight takes, castles, king e7, rook at h to e1 was an inspired idea. The point being that on knight e6, knight c7 allowed white to recoup the sacrificed piece with a continuing initiative and material advantage. After the complications, king f7, rook d7 check, king g6, rook g1 check, king h6, and rook a7 led, after ba5, rook a5, to just an overwhelming 2-pawn winning advantage on the queen side. Very crisp, very, very energetic play by the white player. Next endgame we will look at is the 3-time U.S. champion Joel Benjamin against Grandmaster Gregory Serper. And as we'll see, e4, c5, c3, d5, ed5, queen d5, d4, knight f6, knight out, e6, bishop e2, knight c6, castles, bishop e7, c4. This game follows the lines of the earlier Sveshnikov-Sokolov game that we saw, which led to the knight ending. After queen d8, Benjamin also captures on c5, and after queen d1, rook d1. Now in the earlier game, instead of bishop c5, knight to e4, and after bishop e3, bishop takes c5, and white played the very nice idea knight to d4, looking to exchange two pairs of minor pieces and keeping the f3 square available for his bishop. In this game, Gregory Serper recaptures on c5 immediately, and after knight c3, castles, a3, white starts to get the queen side in motion. After b4, b6, then b4, bishop to e7, and bishop f4. Black played bishop to d7, and now Benjamin plays knight to b5, attacking numerous squares in the enemy camp. After rook at a to d7, knight e5 is one possibility here. This offers to exchange pieces and exposes the pawn on a7. Joel played a very interesting idea with bishop c7, trying to provoke black into voluntarily exchanging rooks. After rook d1, note that rook c8, bishop d6, by exchanging dark squared bishops, the d6 square becomes very vulnerable. After rook e8, bishop takes, rook takes, and knight d6, white can score a bishop. So after rook d1, rook c8, Joel now retreated the bishop back to f4. Note that bishop d6, exchanging dark squared bishops, was also possible. But after bishop f4, bishop back to a8, and now knight e5. This again creates unpleasant problems for black. After the exchange on c6, the pawn on a7 will lack a defender. Note that a6, knight takes, rook takes, and knight a7 simply traps the rook. Very cute. After knight e5, black felt obligated to exchange knights, but now Joel threw in the Zwischenzug knight takes on a7. Note that the routine recapture bishop takes e5, a5, b takes, bishop c3, a4, and bishop b4. Black plays king f8 and seems to be hanging in there. White does have a passed c-pawn, but black has control of the c5 square for the moment. So going back after the very nice knight e5, the excellent knight takes a7. Black countered by attacking the knight, and after knight to b5, offered his own version of a sacrifice with rook takes c4. Joel had to recoup his piece, and the net result is that he has secured the b5 square and does have a healthy 2 versus 1, and the pawn on b6 is a touch weak. After rook to c2, note the immediate rook c8 allows bishop c7, and the pawn on b6 has problems, although he could play knight to d5 and hang in there. In the game after bishop e5, black elected to play rook c2, but after bishop d3, then backed up. Now, on knight a7, black hid his rook with rook f8. Note that rook d8 runs smack into bishop c7, scooping up the b6 pawn. After knight a7, rook f8, Joel switched files to the c file. His plan is simple. He wants to exchange rooks on the c file and highlight the weakness of the pawn on b6. After knight d5, rook c8, he accomplishes the exchange of rooks. After bishop b7, rook takes, king takes, and now bishop e4. Black starts to expand in the center with f6, and here Benjamin played bishop to b2. Zveshnikov thought that this was pretty hard to explain, because he felt that after bishop takes d5, e takes d5, bishop c7, simply wins the pawn on b6. Now, of course, black does have a passed pawn with d4, but after f3, it's really not going to get too far. The white king will simply walk over, blockade this passed d pawn, and meanwhile, the pawn on b6 will fall, and the gradual advance of these two pawns should win the game without too much overwhelming difficulty. So, up to this point, Joel has played just a very, very nice game strategically, and unfortunately, with this slightly passive retreat, he's denied the fruits of his labor. In fact, after h6, the position is now equal, and in fact ended in a draw on move 38. Nonetheless, a very instructive game, and let's go take a look. Again, with c4, queen d8, d takes c5, queen d1, rook d1, and bishop c5, we again reach a very thematic endgame. With a3, white is able to get his queenside pawns going, followed by b4, and again bishop f4, putting the bishop in a supporting role on the queenside. After bishop b7, knight b5, rook d8, the interesting maneuver bishop c7, touching the black rook on d8 and encouraging the exchange of rooks. Off comes one pair of rooks, which, again, keeping in mind Steinitz's principles when playing with a queenside pawn majority, we want to exchange pieces, and especially rooks. After rook c8 and he retreated, white again played the very nice knight e5, maintaining the pressure on the black queenside. And after knight e5, the very nice intermezzo, knight takes a7. What a shot. After rook c7, knight back to b4. Rook c4 and bishop e5, white had reduced down to a 2-to-1 advantage. After the further moves, rook, bishop, and rook back, knight back to a7 again put the pressure on the black rook, and another very nice idea by Joel, rook to c1. The plan, simply rook c8, exchange off the rooks, and leave the pawn exposed. And in fact, he was very close to realizing this if he would have just simply played bishop takes on d5, e takes d5, and bishop c7 would have been the realization of his strategical goal. Very interesting, very instructive game. It's a shame white didn't score the full point. Our next in-game is Grandmaster Jordi Magam Badals against Grandmaster Christian Ionescu. Again, after e4, c5, knight f3, e6, c3, d5, takes on d5, queen takes, d4, knight f6, bishop e2, knight c6, castles, and bishop e7, we reach the same endgame that we saw in Benjamin versus Serper. After c4, black plays a slightly different retreat with queen to d7. But again, after d takes c5, bishop c5, knight c3, b6, a3, the principles are the same. White has the queenside majority. And after bishop b7, goes ahead and expands on the queenside, and after bishop e7, puts his bishop to work with bishop to f4. After castles, queen takes d7, excellent play, trade queens, get the queenside pawn majority rolling. Knight takes d7, rook d1, knight f6, we actually have the same position. In fact, white played knight to b5, and on rook at a to d8, this is the position where Benjamin played the very interesting bishop to c7. In this game, white played knight to e5 immediately, putting pressure on c6 and a7. Here, black miscued with a6. The correct approach actually would be to play a5 and try to create counterplay against the b4 pawn. After a6, white conducted the game in a very instructive manner. Captured on c6, and after bishop takes, simply retreated the knight. The threat now is bishop to c7, and the pawn on b6 definitely becomes a liability. Black exchanged one pair of rooks and offered to exchange the second pair of rooks. Note that rook c8, bishop e3, rook b8, f3 is very pleasant for white. He's got a healthy queenside pawn majority, control of the open file. His king is ready to come up. After rook d8, white opportunistically went ahead and attacked the pawn on b6. After rook d1, bishop d1, the only way to defend the pawn on b6 was with the knight. But here, white played very, very nicely. Defender elimination. Bishop to a4. The bishop has to exchange, and after knight takes, white was able to bring a second attacker to bear on the pawn on b6. First point to note, aside from the fact that black is completely lost at this point, is that after b5, simply c takes b, ab, and knight c3, and like we saw in the Benjamin game, the 2 versus 1 configuration leaves the 1 very, very weak and requiring pieces to defend it. In this case, black has no pieces able to defend and is not able to mount any counterattack against the 2 white pawns on the queen side. Very, very important to understand which structures are advantageous. So after knight takes a4 in the game, black tried for counterplay with a5, a little bit too late. White kept the b pawn on the board, which is very important, and these 2 pawns, once he captures the pawn on b6, will prove absolutely decisive. In fact, for example, if bishop to c5, you simply capture on c5 and pawn takes and bishop takes with a clean sweep. After b5, very nicely done, bishop a3, he captured on b6, and we see that if knight takes, bishop takes, a4, simply bishop back on king f8, b6, on king e8, note bishop d6, c5, bishop back, and c6 would do the trick. And after b6, if king e8, the winning ticket is bishop e5. Again, king d7, b7 pretty much finishes the case. So going back, after knight takes b6, black tried to play knight c5 and erect a blockade. However, the very accurate bishop d6 forced the exchange of one more pair of minor pieces. And after bishop b4, note that knight a4 doesn't help the case because simply bishop a3, knight b6, c5, and on knight c4, you can even go c6, knight b6, bishop c5, and b6. The pawns simply overpower the poor knight. So after bishop d6, bishop b4, captures, bishop takes, and knight d7. Very powerful move, keeping the black king off of f8, attacking the bishop, and covering the b6 and b8 squares. After bishop e7, c5, white started heading upfield with the a-pawn, but he's way too late. b6, and black resigned. After bishop d8, c6, and on bishop b6, knight takes, a3, c7, a2, and white gets there first with mate. So again, after b6, black simply resigned. So this was certainly a fantastically instructive game, going right back to the opening. After c4, slightly different retreat with queen to d7, but the result after d takes c5, bishop c5, we reached our similar 3 to 2 queenside pawn majority endgame. After the usual a3 and b4, white was well in gear and followed with bishop f4, castles, he traded queens, and rook at f to d1. We reached the same position that we had from the Benjamin Serper game. Here, after rook at a to d8, white played the immediate knight a5, putting pressure on the queen side. a6 was definitely a mistake, and after knight takes, bishop takes, and knight c3, black had problems defending the b6 pawn. The exchange of rooks, of course, as we know, helps white. And after rook d8, bishop c7, rook takes, bishop takes, knight d7, it appeared that black had managed to defend his pawn on b6. But the very instructive and decisive bishop a4 not only forced the exchange of the bishops, but after takes, knight takes, brought a second attacker to bear on the weak pawn on b6. From this point, black could do nothing better than lash out for counterplay, but the powerful b5 again overwhelmed the b6 pawn, giving white winners on the c and b file. Passed pawns, connected passed pawns, much stronger than the lone outside passed a pawn. Very, very powerful game played by Grandmaster Badals. Our next in-game was played in Tbilisi, 1974, between Sarkis Bahassian and Elizabar Ubalava. Ubalava would later go on to become a grandmaster. After e4, c5, c3, d5, e takes d5, queen d5, d4, knight f6, knight f3, e6, knight a3, c takes d4, knight b5, knight a6, queen takes d4, bishop c5. Ubalava is a very theoretical player. I played him in 1981 when I played in Tbilisi, and we had a very sharp Grunfeld. He really knows the latest theory. The idea with bishop c5 is for black to try and force white to exchange queens. After queen takes d5, knight d5, white now expands immediately on the queen side with b4. Once again, in retrospect, I would say that I would probably prefer the less committal a3 with the idea of playing c4 and then b4. But at that time, b4 was considered the best way for white to play for advantage. After bishop e7, white now plays a3, securing the queen side and preparing the advance c4. In this game, black still was not aware of the danger and castled. He could resolve the problems on his queen side, that is, the knight on a6, with knight at a to c7. In his book, Sveshnikov points out that after knight c7, rook a2, he says another important position arrives. The advantage undoubtedly lies with white, according to Sveshnikov on his C3 Sicilian book that was published in July of 2010. However, after a5, it's not clear to me that white isn't a little premature with his queenside expansion. For example, after b5, f6 is a very good move for black. The plan is to simply play e5 and gain control of the c5 square. Fritz already considers black might actually even have a slight edge. I have to say, I'm not in love with the white pawn structure at this point. It seems a little bit premature with the advance. But going back to our game at the time, castles, the players with black at this time did not really recognize the danger. White now plays c4, and as we can see, it's all systems go. Bishop to f6. Again, if knight back, we simply avoid the exchange, and on bishop, we can now play bishop to b2, and white has excellent prospects. But after c4, bishop to f6 attacks the rook on a1. After rook a2, knight c3 offers the exchange of knights. After knight takes, bishop takes check, and we interpose our bishop. After bishop f6, white continues with the development with bishop d3. Note that bishop d2, rook d2 happened in a few games and is also very promising for white. Again, the main problem is the knight on a6. So after bishop d2, bishop back to f6, bishop d3, rook d8, bishop e4 is very nice. Again, pressure on the black queen side. Knight back to b8, castles. This is a little bit unclear why we didn't just keep our king in the center and be prepared to swing our rook over. For example, knight c6, bishop e3, e5, rook d2, bishop g4, rook at h to d1, this type of position is well known to favor white. After, say, bishop d4 check, simply bishop takes, pawn takes, and king d3, white has a very clear positional advantage. But in the game, white chose to castle, and after a5, played b5. Now black plays knight d7, hoping to secure control of the c5 square, but white is alert to the situation, and after bishop e3, bishop e7, rook d1, the pin along the d file prevents black from being able to occupy the c5 square. If black could occupy the c5 square, he would be a-okay. In the game, black gives up the c5 square with knight to f6. But if he'd have played rook to f7, rook to f8, the problem he faces there is the tactic bishop takes b7. And after bishop takes, rook takes, white simply wins a pawn, a critical pawn, and the game. So after knight f6, white exchanges one pair of rooks, and after bishop takes, simply retreats his bishop. Even stronger may have been to go ahead and play rook to d2. After bishop e7, you can still retreat the bishop because the pawn on a3 can't be captured because of rook d8 check. Bishop f8, bishop c5, knight d7, you exchange bishops, and then knight e5. f6 allows knight d7 winning material. Since bishop takes, rook takes, is simply a winning ending for white. But going back, after bishop d8, the simple retreat bishop to b1 certainly is good for white as well. After b6, rook d2, we now see that this bishop needs to protect this weak pawn on b6. After bishop to b7, knight e5, rook c8, f3 is very nice, taking control, creating a path for the white king, g6, king f2, h5, king e2, and now king g7. And here the question is, how does white break through? Clearly white has an advantage. And he solves the problem very nicely with the exchange sacrifice. Rook takes d8, which just cuts out the cornerstone of black's queenside defense. After rook takes d8, bishop b6, and we can see he's got a bishop and one pawn for the exchange, but he has two monstrous, powerful connected passed pawns and control of the dark squares. Plus, the black rook is in the box. After bishop d4, he now has a powerful pin, and his c-pawn is ready to motor up the board. After knight e8, c5, bishop d5, b6. The pawns are simply unstoppable. In fact, after f6, white offered the sacrifice of his knight just to get his pawns going. Now he doesn't even bother capturing d5, he simply plays king to d3, and after the further moves king e7, c6, the pawns start to advance. After bishop b3, king d4, bishop d1, h4. Notice how white just takes his time, knowing that the pawns are unstoppable. King f7, and bishop d3. Looks to me like what happened here is, keeping in mind the game was played in 1974 and you had adjournments. It looks to me like white made it to the adjournment and both players studied the position and black resigned without resuming play. After rook d8, king c4, bishop a4, bishop back to e4, rook d1, b7. It's just a matter of time before the pawns pass through. A few more moves and we can see the position is just absolutely without hope for black. So all in all, a very instructive game, slightly different in game. After queen d4, black introduced bishop c5, trying to encourage white to exchange. White obliged with queen takes, and after knight takes, played the immediate b4. And the idea is that after a3 and c4, he gains his space on the queen side. Black threw in bishop f6, rook a2, and knight c3, but all this did was exchange one pair of knights And after bishop d3, rook d8, bishop e4, the black queen side was still under pressure. He still had not solved the problem of the knight on a6, and white was able to build up. Black's a5 tried to create play against the queen side, but here b5, knight d7, bishop e3, and then rook d1 allowed white to keep black from controlling the important c5 square. With f3, white controlled the e4 square and began preparing to bring his king up the board. And then the critical breakthrough finally came with the exchange sacrifice. Rook takes d8. Very powerful, knocking the support out from under the key cornerstone b6 pawn. After bishop takes on b6, white had two monstrous passed pawns. The black rook was forced into passivity, and after bishop d4, the monster bishop on d4 combined with the two passed pawns just simply decided the game. Very, very powerful game by the player playing white, Sarkis Bahassian. Our last endgame with the c3 queenside pawn majority features another American grandmaster, William Lombardi, who was Bobby Fischer's second for the famous Match of the Century in Reykjavik, 1972, is playing white against Asgeir Arnason in Iceland, 1985. When I first came to New York and played in a few tournaments, William Lombardi befriended me, and I have to say he had excellent technique in winning positions. And this game is no exception. After knight f6, knight f3, e6, knight a3, c takes d4, knight b5, knight a6, queen d4, Lombardi certainly is happy to head for the endgame. Black follows the Ubalava game with bishop c5, attacking the queen and encouraging white to exchange queens, which Lombardi is more than happy to do. After queen takes, knight takes, Lombardi played in the same manner with b4, immediately expanding on the queen side, and after bishop e7, a3. And again, at that time, black didn't understand the necessity to play knight at a to c7. Black instead castled, and after c4, bishop f6, rook a2, knight c3, knight takes c3, bishop c3 check, bishop d2, bishop back to f6, bishop d3. If we remember from the Bahassian Ubalava game, black now played rook d8, and after bishop e4 experienced problems with his b7 pawn. In this game, black comes up with a new solution. He develops the bishop, and his idea was to meet bishop e4 with bishop c6, trying to neutralize white's pressure on the queen side. However, this just simply leads to bad pawn structure for black. After bishop e4, black had a fantastic resource with bishop a4. The point being that bishop takes b7, he can slither in with bishop b3, trapping the white rook on a2. A fantastic resource. After bishop a6, bishop a2, king e2, the passed pawns offer white good compensation for the exchange, but probably not more. Back to the game, after bishop e4, bishop c6, white exchanged bishops on c6, and after bc6, simply king up to e2. Black now has the same structure we saw in the knight endgame with Sveshnikov and Andrei Sokolov, namely, he's got these split queenside pawns, and white, for his part, has this very healthy queenside 3-2 pawn majority. Play progresses with rook at f to d8, bishop to e3, and again, in similar fashion, that a7 pawn becomes a little bit of a source of concern for black. After rook d7, white plays rook b1. Again, contemplating rooks behind the passed pawns, contemplating b5, getting the pawns rolling. After h6, he now plays rook d2, offering to exchange one pair of rooks. And he plays rook at a to d8. Notice that if he does exchange rooks, well, probably we'd want to take with a knight. From here, the knight can cartwheel up to e4, the knight could cartwheel over to b3 and on to a5, putting pressure on the pawn on c6. So after rook d2, black played the very natural looking rook at a to d8. And now Lombardi hit him with a really nice technical shot. He played rook at b to d1. Again, keeping in mind we want to exchange rooks. As Steinitz said, when play with the majority, you want to exchange all the pieces, but especially the rooks, especially in a case like this where someone has to defend the a7 pawn. So with rook at b to d1, white now gains control of the d-file, as black cannot exchange all the rooks without dropping his a7 pawn. This really does highlight the weakness of the black queen side. The knight on a6, the pawn on a7 is just a very unhappy configuration. After rook takes, and now if he exchanges, simply king takes, and on bishop b2, b5, pawn takes, and on knight c7, a4 is just simply a winning endgame. This would be one way to handle the case. After rook takes, again rook takes, white could also play very technical fashion with knight takes, and on bishop b2, simply knight back to b1, and black is hard pressed to do anything about his pawn on a7. So in the game after the very nice rook at b to d1, black did exchange one pair of rooks and now tried to hide with his rook. However, abandoning the d-file was no help at all. Rook d7. And after rook c8, rook takes a7, Lombardi simply collected the weak pawn on a7 for a winning advantage. However, it's useful to see his wrap-up technique. After knight c7, bishop b6, the white pieces dominate the board. After knight e8, c5, continuing to nail the knight to e8. After bishop b2, he now brings his own knight into the act, and after knight f6, the black knight finally escapes, but meanwhile the white knight is on the way. And after bishop d4, he could simply play knight to d6, rook f8, and rook c7, collecting a third pawn, but instead, after bishop d4, Lombardi hits him with a little combination, rook takes f7. The point being, if king f7, knight d6 check, and white will be two solid pawns ahead. In the game, after rook takes f7, black continued with knight d5, but after rook d7, went ahead and resigned. Again, a very precision-like technical performance by Grandmaster Lombardi. We can see why Bobby Fischer, in an important match against Foxy for the World Championship, selected Lombardi as a second. In terms of the recap for this game, after queen takes d4, bishop c5, white exchanged queens and then played b4. After bishop e7, a3, c4, we reached the same endgame that we had before, and now bishop d7 was a new move. After bishop e4, white would have had problems showing an advantage after bishop to a4, but instead after bishop c6, the exchange of bishops gives black weak pawns on the queen side. After king up, rook over, bishop to e3, the pawn on a7 was very weak, and a very nice technical shot here, offering to exchange rooks, and after rook at a to d8, rook at b to d1 offered to exchange both pairs of rooks, leaving the pawn on a7 indefensible. Very nice technical game by Lombardi. After the exchange of one pair of rooks, and simply rook d7, left white with a completely overwhelming winning position. The a-pawn simply dropped off the board. Note here, trying to get counterplay with bishop to b2 probably just runs into something devastating like pawn to b5. After pawn takes, again, this really highlights the weakness of this poor knight over on a6. Here, for example, knight b8, you would have the pleasant choice of rook takes collecting a pawn, or rook check, king up, and pawn up. And this poor knight is just pinned and it's a miserable, miserable existence. Again, a very nice technical performance by white, showing how to use the queenside pawn majority. So we've now studied about 10 endgames, very typical with this type of pawn structure. With the c3 Sicilian, there are a handful of these endgames that arise where you do have this 3-2 queenside pawn majority. Understanding how to play it, using the Steinitz rules, exchanging pieces, is essential to winning technique. One of the things in my work with Karpov and his team that I began to realize is in whatever openings they played, they understood exactly which endgames had danger in them and which ones were defendable. Sometimes black could sacrifice a pawn and try to survive. Here, the play is very technical in nature. White looks to put his bishops on f4 and maybe on f3, pressure these two pawns on the queen side, exchange rooks on the d file, and every time you exchange pieces, it brings you closer towards realizing your queenside pawn advantage. This is a very, very powerful secret weapon that a lot of people are not even aware of is inherently built in the c3 Sicilian. The last two games that we will look at in Volume 1 are much more contemporary theoretical games. The first of these two features GM Evgeny Sveshnikov playing Viktor Kaprychik, e4, c5, c3, queen a5. Again, this is a strange move that was first employed by Siegbert Tarrasch in 1898, as we saw in the history section. This game is played in Kiev, 1984. The idea, of course, is black understands white wants to play d4, therefore he pins the c-pawn against the white king. So, Sveshnikov continues with knight to f3, and after knight to c6, introduces a different approach. He plays a3. Even so, with the benefit of hindsight, Sveshnikov now considers that bishop c4 might be the best way to play. Myself, I kind of prefer knight a3, but you don't have to rush to play knight c4 so quickly the way Tarrasch's opponent did in that historical game we looked at. Anyway, continuing on, Sveshnikov played a3, and this certainly worked out for him, as we will see. After e6, Sveshnikov now played d4, and black took advantage of this pin that we mentioned with knight takes d4. Black played pawn takes on d4, and after c takes d4, now played b4. This attacks the queen while he still has a pawn on c3, thus preventing any type of bonsai bishop takes b4 check business. Now in the game, black played a bit passively with queen c7, which is rather strange considering Kaprychik was really known as something of a tactician. More challenging would be to play queen e5. And after queen takes d4, queen takes d4, pawn takes d4, d5, ed5, ed5, knight c3, white has a very minimal advantage. Like, he's still got the extra move, but it is a symmetrical pawn structure. So going back after b4, black backed up with queen to c7, and now pawn takes pawn, and white has not only established the pawn duo on e4 and d4, he's even gained some space on the queen side. After knight f6, bishop d3, black now erred with d5. Probably better would be to chip away at this advanced b-pawn and try and get some counterplay on the queen's wing. Instead, after d5, white played e5, and after knight to d7, note that knight e2, f3 actually creates problems for the knight. Knight c3 is the only square, and then queen c2 simply pinning and winning the knight. So going back after e5, the knight had to back it up to d7, but now Sveshnikov plays very nicely, rook a2. This way, the rook immediately comes to the c-file to take control. After knight b6, rook c2, and queen d8, white clearly has a souped-up French defense from white's point of view. He now went ahead and put the queen to work on the king side, because where white wins games usually in the French defense is on the king side. Why? Because this is where he has his space advantage with this pawn. So here, white has several pluses. The queen is attacking g7. This light squared bishop is beautifully posted, and he even controls the c-file. We can definitely say this opening has been a success. Space advantage, c-file, lead in development. Black played g6, and now, bam, bishop g5. In principle, in the French defense, with all the pawns, or most of the pawns, on light square for black, white likes to exchange the dark squared bishops. That obviously will leave several holes. But what's nice here is after bishop e7, he even went for more. Bishop h6 now keeps black from castling kingside. So the poor king now is stuck in the center. Black decided time to develop the queen side with bishop d7, white castles, and after bishop a4 simply nudges up one tick. a6, hard to find any kind of active plan for black at this point. White now takes over control of the c-file, and after rook c8, exchanges one pair of rooks, and after knight takes, I like what he did here. Most players would just almost automatically play knight to c3 and gain a tempo on the bishop. And this is certainly not bad at all, but the question is, longer term, what is the plan? Well, let's look at the pawn structure. Pawn structure almost invariably tells you a few things: relative value of the pieces and strategic plan. Here, white has a space advantage on the king side, thanks to his pawn on e5. The rook on the c-file goes a long way towards neutralizing any play black might have on that wing, but where white's real advantage is on the king side, where this pawn covers these squares. This bishop keeps him from castling. He's got this bishop aimed, and he's got the queen in the vicinity. Therefore, white should be attacking on the king side. Thus, more troops come to the side where he has superior mobility. Therefore, I really like this move, knight to d2. After bishop f8, of course, white's idea with knight to d2 is simply to continue on with knight to f3, knight to g5, and bam, queen f4, just simply overpowering the f7 square. So after knight to d2, black decided he needed to do some unraveling on the king side and offered to exchange bishops. And here, again, white plays queen to f4. By preventing black from castling, he prevents black from connecting his queen and his rook. Knight to a7, black tries to whip up some counterplay on the queen's wing. Meanwhile, as we mentioned, this knight continues on over to the king side. And now, knight to c6. Note that if the knight had gone to b5, trying to create a little counter threat, a diversion, white could just continue on with knight to g5, attacking the more vital f7 point. And after queen d7, you could get a deflection motif, like rook c8 check. Of course, king e7, queen f6 mate. And if queen takes on c7, then check. King takes, knight check. It's mate, except he can give up the queen. And after queen takes, bishop takes. Bishop takes threatens mate on d7. And after bishop takes, queen f6 check scores the rook and leaves white with a massive amount of material advantage. So going back, after knight to f3, black kept the knight closer toward the center. But now, white exchanges the dark squared bishops, and after king takes, note that rook takes, knight g5 is very powerful, but also after rook takes, queen firing in is strong, and on a5, b5, knight a7, knight to g5. This is a very, very strong attack for the white pieces. So going back, after bishop takes, king takes, queen h6 check. King goes to g8, and white continues to build on the king side with h4. Notice white is able to do this because black has been unable to generate any counterplay on the queen side, or, more importantly, counterplay on the king side. After queen f8, again, Steinitz principles, when you have a space advantage, you maintain the pieces on the board. After h6, white now plays h5, looking to open up lines against the enemy king. g5, trying to keep it locked up. After g takes h4, of course, white could just recoup the pawn, have a healthier pawn structure. So after g5, Now he sinks the queen in there to f6. And this is the part of the game that I really like. After queen g7, he doesn't try to do anything quick. Let's take a quick look after g4. g4, knight h2. And on knight takes d4, seemingly gaining something by capturing the center pawn, queen f4 is very strong. When the knight retreats, now knight takes g4, and then suddenly we can see this knight is coming to the very powerful f6 square. After queen g7, you have the fantastic move b5. Lateral attack on the bishop, and after a takes b, rook takes, defender elimination, b takes, and then knight f6 check, and king f8, and queen b4 check. And thus we understand why the knight on c6 had to go, to allow queen b4 check. After c5, of course, queen takes c5 is checkmate. So going back after queen to f6, we see g4 would be just a bit loosening for the black king. Therefore, queen g7 was played. But now white, in turn, plays g4 himself. And this is one of the things that really impressed me about this game, is in the best style of someone like Aaron Nimzovich, Sveshnikov just puts his opponent in the box. In the game, black exchanged queens. But let's take a look. If he plays king f8, for example, well, then you have the shot rook takes, because of course pawn takes allows simply queen d8 mate. And so after rook takes, if queen takes on f6, you also have rook c8 check, king g7, and e takes f6 check, deflecting the black king from defending the rook on h8. So after rook takes, bishop takes, you then play queen d8 check, bishop e8, and now, again, totally demonstrating superior mobility, you attack on the other wing. Notice all the black pieces have now gone to the king side, and white therefore has a free hand on the queen side. f6 to try and break out, e takes f6, queen d7 to try and exchange queens, and white would have a choice of methods here to exploit this. The simplest is probably queen takes d7, bishop takes, and bam, knight e5. Black has two ways to go here. The bishop on d7 is obviously under attack, and note how the king and rook are still boxed in the corner. If bishop takes b5, you simply exchange, and then knight check, king over, and then again a little deflection motif. Check, king up, knight takes, and queens. So going back after knight e5, if bishop e8, knight check, again is a fork on the rook and the king. After bishop takes, pawn takes, we now see the threat of a pawn fork here. After rook g8, white plays the amazing b6, and after you study the position for a little bit, you realize black simply has no more moves. After a4, any move black plays will result in losing material. And I very much like this configuration with the two passed pawns against the rook and king. If the king moves, then you have f7. If the rook moves, you have g7 with a decisive fork in either case. Fantastic, very impressive play by Sveshnikov. So after g4, black could see nothing better than to exchange queens. And keep in mind, his opponent in this game, Grandmaster Kuprychik, was quite a regular in the Soviet championships in the 1970s. So after e takes f6, king f8. Now, knight e5, again trying to penetrate with his rook to c8. If knight takes, rook check, bishop back, d takes e, and again we see black is in the box. He will never, ever get out. So going back, after knight e5, king e8, he now hits him with bishop takes a6. The point here is that if he takes this, he captures on c6, and after bishop takes, rook takes, threatens a skewer, and threatens to simply collect a second pawn. So after the shot, bishop takes a6, Again, this is a deflection motif. The b pawn is overworked, trying to defend c6 and trying to defend a6. After knight e5, Sveshnikov avoided complications. He could win in complicated style with rook c8 check, king d7, rook h8, where he has won the exchange, but after knight f3 check, king g4, knight h4 check, king g3, b takes a6, f4, it is a bit messy. White will eventually take on h6, should be winning, but why get involved? After knight takes e5, Sveshnikov stuck to the very, very clear, precise plan. He simply recaptured on e5, leaving black in the box with a second pawn attacked and the skewer threatened. Of course, if b takes a6, rook c8 check. So after d takes e5, king d7, white collected a second pawn. This gives him a clearly winning ending. After rook b8, bishop a6, rook a8, bishop back to d3, bishop b3, and now I very much like the way Sveshnikov kept the initiative here. b5, using the passed pawn. After rook a4, note that rook a3, b6, and the pawn simply is ready to go. Once you drop back, rook check, the pawn over here on f7 would be hanging. So in the game, black played rook a4, trying to generate play on the king side. A little late in the day, b6, rook g4 check, king h2. And now, bishop c4, trying to exchange bishops. And again, powerful play. Bishop to g6. The pawn on f6 is qualitatively much more valuable than the pawn on f7. Why? Because this pawn on f6 is 2 squares from queening. This pawn is like 5 or 6 moves from ever becoming a queen. This is what we call a qualitative superiority. So after the shot bishop g6, well, we can easily see that after fg, hg, white just simply has too many passed pawns, black will be overpowered. So after this fantastic shot bishop g6, black found a resource, bishop to e2. And right about this point, they just made time control. The idea here is that black wants to deliver perpetual check. Check, check, check. So that's the point of this strange looking move, bishop to e2. So basically all white has to do is to break this perpetual check. And it was Sveshnikov's turn to actually, in those days, you wrote a move down, put it in an envelope, and that was that. So rook c7 check would be winning, f3 attacking the rook would be winning. In the game, Sveshnikov played f4. A bit sharp, but also quite sufficient. After bishop to c4, captured on f7, rook takes f4, he now put his rook behind the passed pawn. After king c8, he collected another very valuable pawn on e6, and after king b8, rook to b4, black played king b7, white played f7, and black resigned. The threat here is simply bishop takes, check, and after bishop takes, simply exchange rooks, and after pawn takes, this one goes in. So let's go back and do a quick recap of this powerful performance by the godfather of the C3 Sicilian. First off, black employed what I consider to be probably a bit dubious, this queen a5 maneuver. As play transpired, white got a French defense. Black's d5 was not the best. He would have been better served to have played a5, trying to expose white on the queen side. After d5, e5, knight back to d7, rook a2, knight b6, rook c2, queen d8, and queen g4, white had all systems go. Basically all the advantages of the French defense and none of the deficits. No double pawns, no problems on the queen side. White had pretty much everything you could want for. After only 13 moves, this opening was a tremendous success for white. As we saw from here, it was very easy to build up. Moves like bishop to g5, and after bishop e7, bishop h6, preventing black from castling, not allowing him to connect his queen and his rook. Other moves like rook fc1, and knight d2 showed how easy it was to build up and play the white position. Moves like queen f4 still continued to prevent black from being able to castle, and then later bringing the knight over to the king side. This was key. This is the sector where white wants to be attacking, because this is the sector where he has the space advantage. And then I have to say, later, I quite like, after the queens were exchanged, how white just continued to build a position with moves like h4. After queen f8, he backed up. On h6, he chipped away, trying to open the king side, and on g5, in with the queen. And after queen g7, g4, very, very powerful, completely putting black in the box. Just an absolutely exquisite performance. This is the kind of game that it pays to study time and time again. And then later, when black tried to get unraveled and bring his king to the queen side, he struck while the iron was hot. Knight e5, and on king e8, bishop takes a6, netted a pawn. When white tried to confuse the issue, he had nothing to do with the complications, simply recapturing, and with the dual threat of rook check and bishop takes b7, white won a second pawn and a completely winning endgame. Again, very impressive performance by Evgeny Sveshnikov. The last game that I want to share with you on this first volume of DVDs is from my own practice. After e4, c5, c3, b6. Fairly infrequent, but it's important to understand exactly how to play. Obviously, black wants to fianchetto his bishop and immediately put pressure on the e4 pawn. I continue, of course, d4, bishop b7, and now knight to d2. You can play bishop d3, but after knight f6, queen e2, cd, cd, knight c6, there's pressure on the d4 pawn. And when you play knight f3, knight to b4 is very unpleasant because the bishop on d3 and the pawn on e4 complex is under pressure. And I really don't like to give up my bishop on d3 if I don't have to. For example, after knight c3, knight takes, queen c8, black already threatens the annoying, very annoying, bishop to a6. Black has good play in spite of white's pawns on e4 and d4. Therefore, even with these offbeat systems, it's very good to have a clear understanding of what your opponent is trying to accomplish. So I played d4, and after bishop b7, I prefer the move order knight to d2. Now after cd, cd, and knight f6, I'm able to play bishop to d3, and after knight c6, knight at g to f3. Knight e2 is also possible, and g6. This was actually the game Sveshnikov against Kogan in Nova Gorica in 2000, and Sveshnikov with white did win in 56 moves. But if we can develop the knight to f3, it is a little more aggressively placed. Now my opponent in this game played knight to b4, went after my bishop on d3. And again, because he's attacking the pawn on e4 twice, I have to back up to b1. And now bishop a6. This is very tempting and very reasonable. Pressures the d3 square and the whole diagonal and prevents white from comfortably castling. If white could kick the knight, castle, and centralize, he would have a very clear advantage. So now I played e5. I attacked this knight on f6. After knight at f to d5, I continue to centralize my knights with knight e4 and incidentally cover the vital d3 square. Black plays rook c8, and I go ahead and give him the kick with a3. He backs up with knight to c6. Note that queen c7 was an alternative. But then I could contemplate playing a takes on b4, and the bishop on a6 is under attack. After knight c6 in the game, my problem is I would like to castle, but this bishop is extremely well placed. So, how to get rid of it and start to solve the problem with my queenside congestion. I wasn't happy about playing bishop to d3, but bishop g5, queen c7 didn't seem like that big a deal. And with bishop d3, I do allow him to exchange, but on the other hand, I have more space in the center. given a few moves, I will play bishop d2, b4, rook to c1, and start trying to squeeze him maybe on the queen side, or maybe at some point in the center. And when he goes e6 and castles, I might have knight to g5, creating threats on the king side. So in the game, my opponent played knight at c to b4. He saw a tactical opportunity here. This attacks my queen and threatens the fork on c2. I went ahead and captured, and after knight takes, he simply renews the threat. So here, I played queen to b5, and after knight check, king up, and knight takes a1, black is in fact a pawn and the exchange ahead. However, in chess, it's important to keep in mind the different elements and the trade-off. And two of the elements are time versus material. And there's also the element of force. But in terms of time, white is way ahead in time. These black pieces have yet to be developed. And it's going to require quite a few moves to get them into the game. White, on the other hand, is completely developed, has fantastic force in the center. So here I played bishop to g5. Two threats. One, simply to remove this knight, and two, the powerful shot knight to d6 check would be extremely embarrassing for black. So after bishop g5, in order to not just simply allow rook takes, and I have two fantastic pieces for a rook and a pawn, black played f6 to try and maintain his material advantage. I now played rook takes on a1, and after f takes g5, another very important move, e6. This takes advantage of the pin on the d7 pawn, and either knight can go take the pawn on g5, but the important point is to keep black boxed up. By keeping the e pawn boxed, I keep the f8 bishop boxed. By keeping the f8 bishop boxed, we keep the h8 rook still in the box. Black played rook c2 check. Of course, played king to d3. I guess king d1 is possible as well. And after rook back to c6, I now mobilize this knight and threaten to fork on f7, keeping my pawn on e6 protected. After queen c7, I'm able to mobilize the second knight and hit the critical c6 and d7 squares. Black could find nothing better than rook d6, and of course at this point I could already play pawn takes pawn, securing a material advantage and still leaving him with these undeveloped pieces, but I saw a huge opportunity here. I played rook to c1. This deflection sacrifice tries to lure the black queen away from the defense of his king. If queen b7, I simply take, and on rook takes, pawn takes, queen takes, and rook c8 mate, thanks to the pin on the black queen. In the game, after rook c1, black took the rook on c1, and now we hit him with queen takes d7 check. Of course, black has no choice but to capture, and after pawn takes on d7 check, king to d8, we have a very nice mate with two knights and the pawn. Again, totally exploiting superior mobility and lack of development. Let's do a quick recap. Going right to the opening, white played b6. Obviously wants to put pressure on my center. After d4, bishop b7, knight d2, I'm able to maintain the pawn duo in the center. However, after further pressure on the center, knight out and then knight b4, I have to back up my bishop, and now the very interesting bishop a6 takes this diagonal, keeps me from castling. Therefore, I played e5, attacking the knight, and after the knight moved, knight e4 centralizing my knight and covering the sensitive d3 square. After rook c8, we'd go ahead and kick his knight, and then exchange light squared bishops. Positionally, exchanging the light squared bishops is a plus for black. However, white does have more space and control in the center. After bishop takes, queen takes, and knight takes, black should play a move like e6, or maybe a move like queen c7. Instead, knight b4, he went chasing tactics in a position where he's not fully developed. So, of course, we capture, and after queen takes, we allow knight check, and knight takes. But white's way ahead in time. White has more development, more central control, and after bishop g5, direct threats to simply capture on a1 or to thunk in with knight d6 check. After f6, rook takes, f takes, and e6. This is very important, keeping black in the box. Very similar to the technique that we saw Sveshnikov use in the previous game. After check, king up, rook back, one knight comes in, and after queen up, a second knight comes in. This set the stage for the deflection rook sacrifice. Once that was accepted, that led to check, check, and mate. Thank you very much for watching. So thank you for watching, and in volume 1 here, we have seen the historical overview. We saw some basic strategies and plans for both sides. We also saw the extremely important winning with the queenside majority, and we began looking at the theoretically important games, 2 b6, and even 2 queen a5, and the anti-positional, in my view, 2 e5. Against each of these, we will show you very good examples of how to play, how to achieve some type of advantage for white. Coming DVD Volume 2, we will have 2 very enterprising, very important theoretical, analytical weapons that you will be able to use to win many, many games.